Okay, looks like we're recording. And guys, I am so excited to have on the program Andy Stepanian. Andy is most well known as a member of the SHAC 7, that's the Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, the American activist. And he was one of the activists along with the SHAC 7 who got prosecuted, ended up doing time. I feel like I know a lot about this, Andy, now having like delved into it for a while, but I'm guessing that a lot of listeners, this is going to be new to them. So maybe we should just go back and start with Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty and what that campaign was all about.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. And then the campaign against Huntingdon Life Sciences largely began in the UK. It sprung out of several other very successful campaigns that targeted breeders for vivisection. And when those campaigns were successful and they closed those farms, they said, well, what's the next big pie in the sky victory that we could shoot for? And it was Huntingdon Life Sciences that had facilities in Auckland and in England. And they knew that they were, at the time, between the second and third largest animal testing facility in the world. In addition to Auckland and they also had facilities in Japan and in the United States in East Millstone, New Jersey. And so in the first few years, the campaign was largely centralized to the United Kingdom. And around 2001 around 2000, they started relying on the Bank of New York for the handling their American depository receipts on the stock market. And at that point, activists from the UK came to the United States and met with United States activists and encouraged them to get involved with their own campaign against the Bank of New York. And that's where myself and Lauren Gazzola first met some of the individuals involved with the UK campaign, and we started campaigning in New York City.
Okay, great. Yeah, Lauren is the only other member of the SHAC 7 that I've actually met in person. And I've only spoken with one other, and that's Jake Conroy, who's, one of the more public-facing members. It seems like a lot of the members of the SHAC 7 lead sort of private lives. Now, I've seen some interviews with you, but that's interesting. Why do you think that is? Was it just like that? And we'll get into some of the repressive tactics that the government used. Is that part of why you think that is, or is it just like, was it y'all's personalities to not really aim for the spotlight so much?
I don't know if I can answer for my co-defendants. And honestly, the answer for myself is also complicated. Just to rewind for 1 second, I wasn't very articulate about what the campaign entailed. So my first entree to the campaign was being involved with protesting the Bank of New York. But one of the things that made the campaign against Huntingdon Life Sciences significant and unique was that they began looking at secondary and tertiary targets that relate to the laboratory. Instead of standing outside the laboratory with placards saying, hey, you abuse dogs every single day, and saying shame, those employees knew what they were doing. They understood that they were receiving a paycheck for wanton abuse of animals for the purposes of contract research to put products on the market. Also, another thing that was highlighted about this campaign is that Huntingdon Life Sciences, as a CRO or contract research organization, is not engaged in the same quote unquote life-saving research that other academic laboratories may be involved with here in the United States. That is a different moral argument. So what we were able to do with Huntingdon Life Sciences, they utilize dogs, and people have dogs in their homes. We used it as a nexus to say, hey, do you empathize with your dog at home? Well, there's dogs like your dog inside of Huntingdon Life Sciences, and they're testing products on them for market. Products like agrochemicals, bleaches, things that we already know are unsafe for human consumption, and yet they're trying to rubber stamp them to market. And we didn't have to deal with like the thorniness of an issue like cancer research or something else. We were actually dealing with product testing. And so this was a good kind of segue to the general public to start talking about the rights of dogs, and maybe they'd start considering other animals that were at that laboratory, like the rats and the monkeys and others. And so this was a overarching animal rights campaign, but then nested inside of it was a very tactical campaign that targeted secondary and tertiary pillars of support. And it was largely modeled off of previous movements like the South African anti-apartheid movement and the movement of ACT UP San Francisco that targeted pharmaceutical companies. And so we cribbed a lot of those tactics from those movements and applied it to the laboratory. And so this was happening for about a year and a half. My co-defendant, Kevin Jonas, went to the UK to be part of the campaign. I hadn't met him yet. And when the issue of the American depository receipts came about in the United States, running through the Bank of New York is when some of the other UK activists came to New York City to meet with local activists. And they happened to meet with myself, our colleague Joe Bateman, and Lauren Gazzola, and we started a campaign against the Bank of New York. It was not called SHAC USA at the time. It was actually, I think, run through In Defense of Animals. I would recommend you go back and fact check me, because I have a vague memory that they were involved at the beginning and then they may have backed out because of a lawsuit. But it was nebulous at first. It wasn't a hardened organization yet. It was just like a bunch of people getting together to help.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry if I'm jumping
okay.
around a little bit. I just thought for the public to hear that part about what made the campaign kind of unique. It'll explain later on why we ended up in prison, because they thought that our tactics were so unique that it was something they couldn't quite pin down yet, and they tried to make it criminal.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because from my viewing of the SHAC campaign, it looked extraordinarily successful, and at the same time, and then I guess that was the reason. That was, of course, the reason why the government came down so hard on it. I've talked to Tom Harris, who gave me kind of the UK perspective about it. And so he was able to talk some about, what led up to the SHAC campaign in the UK. And then also just the incredible drive and momentum that the campaign was able to capture. Maybe you can take me back to how that felt, like how like that kind of like excitement, because it seemed like in the UK at least, and I'm guessing in America too, it's been a little while since I read about it. Seemed like you guys were just knocking off wins kind of one by one. And that must have just felt extraordinary. And then when did it start to turn, I guess? But maybe go back to the beginning when things were going so well.
So what's interesting about that is that I could speak a little bit about what I saw, but I also had a sense of some of the historic pretext prior to our victories. And I got involved with the animal rights movement in the late 90s. I came to the animal rights movement by way of human rights activism and environmental activism. I first went vegetarian when I was 13, but I didn't go vegan until I met other vegans in college, in my first year of college. And so I was vegetarian into environmental issues, into human rights issues, and then finally met people that were involved with animal rights in college. And I was smitten at the idea of like undercover investigations and breaking in and filming. Like it was something that I think I was drawn to initially for the wrong reasons, because I wanted to just kind of like get in it and get in the trenches. And what I should have done first is researched everything, read everything, been vegan for a while, but I just kind of thrust myself into it. And I stayed for the right reasons, don't get me wrong, right? But I'm just saying, like, it was macho reasons for initially getting involved, which I'm not that proud of, right?
I see. So it was like cool and sexy is what you mean, kind
of.
Yeah.
If you interview people from that time period, a lot of young men got involved by way of the hardcore scene. I kind of came there in a roundabout way. This could be saved for later, but I had a little bit of a tumultuous childhood, and one of my closest friends, their mother passed away from breast cancer, and we knew that their home was on former farmland that was not cleaned up. There was a lot of like, agrochemicals and things like that remained buried in the ground. And that actually, whether or not it was correlative or not, motivated me at a young age to get involved with environmental issues as it relates to Superfund sites. And I started doing environmental activism around the age of 13 or 14. And so that motivation and that activism kind of connected me to like hippie groups and Amnesty International and things like that. I didn't know what the hardcore scene was yet, right? The only kind of punk rock or alternative music I knew of was through those like VHS surfing videos that would make the rounds in high school, where people were like looking at the latest surf moves, and whatever the soundtrack was, I'd learn about the music through that. Come like senior year in high school, first year of college is when I first started like learning about DIY shows. And so I kind of came to it indirectly. So people were like, wait, you went vegetarian because of what? Like Earth Crisis or Vegan Straight Edge? And I was like, no, I actually went vegetarian because I read about this thing when I was 13. And they were kind of like, I was kind of an outlier even in that group, right? But then a lot of the people I met and I started organizing with came from that scene. And I eventually kind of got braided into that scene from like 19 or 20 years old. But prior to that, in the 1980s in New York, there was this robust animal rights movement through a group called Trans Species Unlimited. And I saw photographs that some of the older activists would share with us of 1,000 or more people coming out for Free Friday. And when I was organizing with the Animal Defense League of Long Island or the Animal Defense League of New York, we were lucky to get 35 people outside of a fur shop. Also, there was this fatigue of we were just like hopping from one thing to the next to the next. So we'd be protesting foie gras one day, we'd be protesting outside of a fur shop the next day, another kind of fur shop the next day, an Urban Outfitters type store called Yellow Rat Bastard. We used to picket there, demanding that they change different things in their fashion line. That was a successful campaign, but most of them were us just screaming at buildings, right? And it kind of felt a little bit exhausting. It also felt like we were very spread thin. And one thing that SHAC provided was some sort of cohesion and also a tactical structure where people can tag in their different cities, find a tertiary or secondary target related to the laboratory and protest that. And what made those targets so interesting is that those targets did not need Huntingdon Life Sciences to survive, but Huntingdon Life Sciences needed them. And so sometimes they were quick victories. I remember our protest campaign against Deloitte & Touche lasted less than a week, and they're the nation's largest auditor. So something as simple as walking into the auditor, behind a Domino's pizza guy, getting past security and then throwing leaflets in all the cubicles, it was just something that made the corporate governance head spin. Like, how did these people get in here? They occupied our office for a few minutes. It didn't even lead to us getting arrested, right? I remember the Nassau County PD was outside and they said, well, as long as you leave the premises in the next 5 minutes, we're not going to charge you with criminal trespass. And so we just marched out to the highway, stayed on the median for a while holding signs after throwing all the leaflets around. And that was the end of our protest campaign. The next day we found out we won. It's like, don't get me wrong, that was mentioned in our federal indictment years later, right?
Yeah.
But like,
I was going to say that's the action that
even the local police are like, listen, we're not even going to ticket you if you just go out to the median, and we did that.
Yeah.
So like that's what that day was not tense at all. That day was like civil, and then years later it's talked about in the most hardcore kind of narrative.
Yeah, not to skip ahead, but that is the action, right? That ultimately led to your conviction was throwing the leaflets.
It's hard to tell which one it was, but they were trying to create connective tissue between myself and Kevin and Lauren. And it seemed to be that Deloitte & Touche was the one because they got temporarily delisted, I believe, from the stock exchange for a period of time because they required an auditor in order to be compliant. And so, we're talking a very low-key action. At most 15 people participated. We assembled at a health food store. We handed out our signs to each other. We all got in cars. We all kind of ran up to the building right around lunchtime. We worked it out that like the moment the Domino's pizza guy was going in, we just kind of bum rushed right behind him. And then all we were doing is one person had a bullhorn, explained the reason why we were there. And we were handing out leaflets, just to make it even more placid. We were handing out leaflets at each cubicle, putting them on people's desks, explaining what they were investing in. And when we were finally pushed out, there was this second floor balcony, and that overlooked the kind of common area in this office complex, because it wasn't just Deloitte & Touche, it was other companies that shared this kind of office park. And this common area had a cafeteria and like kind of open air dining area. And so everyone who was taking their lunch break, a lot of them were just in this open air area eating their lunch. So there's maybe 50, 60 people downstairs eating lunch. And I remembered seeing the last stack of my flyers and I just threw them off the median or whatever you call it, the railing, and it kind of just rained down on everybody eating lunch. And I remember that's when some cop was like, "That's it." And he kind of grabbed my shirt and pulled me outside. And I was certain I was getting arrested, right? But then he's like, "If you guys just get the F out of here, like, and, you know, stay off the property, like I won't arrest you." And we took it as a win already. We're like, okay, if he doesn't want to arrest us, we're good. And we went out to the side of the street, stayed there for about another 30 or 40 minutes because it was like early March. So there's still a little bit of snow on the ground, maybe a little bit of rain. Like it wasn't the most comfortable. And then we, I don't know, got coffee or whatever we did next. You know, we went on with our afternoon. The next morning we find out that we win. So, I mean, if that's the connective tissue that led to my federal indictment and cost me to spend at least 3 years in federal prison, a portion of which in the maximum, I don't know, man. I have trouble processing if that's the reason.
It's nuts because now I've been in the movement now 7 years, having done activism, like all you're doing is what I see a lot of my friends do, which is just like a little bit of mischief for the for the cause of the campaign. You know, there's that great quote. I think it was John Lewis, the late congressperson, who said, you know, I think it was his quote about, you know, getting in good trouble. And that's just what you were doing, you know, just, and even just.
But also, I should be honest, right?
Yeah.
The statute of limitations have expired, right? I do not want to thumb my nose at the police or the FBI or anything else like that. Like, touche, you guys beat me for a period of time, right? But you know, I broke into HLS. I freed 14 dogs. I have no shame in that. I was not charged with that. That was not connected to our conspiracy. In fact, one of the reasons why I kept my mouth shut during the entire indictment was in the back of my mind, I was convinced that my activities were going to hurt my co-defendants and hurt my friends. I kept thinking somehow they're going to start to articulate during the trial that I'm the one who took the dogs. And then that somehow, I don't know, Kevin gave me $50 to spend on a sign or something, and that they're going to try to make this connective tissue, and my criminality is going to somehow hurt all my friends, and I'm going to be the reason why this ship sinks. That's what I thought, because I wasn't really like, and I don't mean to like sound self-deprecating, but I wasn't like the SHAC guy. I was just like an activist in New York that was helping them, right? And so I've always wondered, was it the dogs, and did they choose not to charge me with the dogs? Or was it something as mundane as the Deloitte & Touche throwing of the leaflets? I really don't know. So I played a role in some of the tactical stuff. I had no connections to the website, which is articulated a lot in the movie. I really don't know. I don't know if I have the full answers. And my memory's not great of those years either, because like maybe there is one detail that stands out that made me more of a target than other people. But I think what it was, I think like, they always thought I was a member of the ALF. They always thought that I was freeing animals. Maybe they couldn't build a case against me. They saw an opportunity to kind of shoehorn me into this. And they thought maybe, well, if I do open my mouth, it can expand into a larger indictment if I try to defend myself. Or if I just very clearly state what I did, it could inadvertently hurt my co-defendants, and that I could become a liability to my co-defendants. And so I just kind of sat there quietly, signed a joint defense agreement with my co-defendants, saying that I wouldn't cooperate against them or take a plea deal, and took the lumps on the head while they were talking about me in this light. But even what the prosecutor orated, it didn't make much sense about how I connected to the case. I think they were hoping for something else. And I've always debated too, because this kind of relates to some things that are happening nowadays, is I think, our indictment, our federal indictment, had a beginning and ending timeline, right? It was called the timeline of the conspiracy. And the starting date of the timeline of the conspiracy begins the day after I freed the dogs. And I always wondered, why did they choose the day after? Because the campaign began well before that, right? And I was like, did they intentionally move it one day after so that way this wouldn't be included in the evidence? And in my mind, I'm like, is that because they want to charge me separately? Or is it because mentioning the freeing of these dogs would then allow to be entered into the trial? Well, what were these dogs experiencing and why did they need to be rescued?
Yeah.
Right? Which would then potentially play to the sympathies of the jury.
Right.
And could potentially backfire on the prosecutors. And I mean, that was a lot to kind of sit with during those years because I truly had no idea. I was too afraid to speak to my attorneys about it because I was afraid like they'd speak to each other and then the federal government would learn more.
Wow.
I was pulled sidebar once or twice by either the prosecutors or the judge where they alluded to knowing that I was involved with more. And some of it hit close to home, but also some of it wasn't related to me at all, which made me think maybe they don't know what's going on. You know, like maybe it's all just bluster and threats. So I don't know, you know, and I'm sure if one of them listens on this other end, you know, they may be a little bit annoyed that I'm talking about this now. Like I'm not actually trying to stir the pot here. I'm just trying to speak honestly with you to kind of give you a sense of what happened during those years.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I had those questions because I've been watching interviews with you, you know, so that I could learn more to prepare for this. And I know in one interview or talk you gave before, you know, some sort of presentation, you were talking about that you now know that you had an FBI file on you dating way back to when you had done some sort of investigation for PETA at that time. I think you mentioned at that time some sort of like footage that you had gotten. So yeah, you were on there.
Would it be the circus?
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
I think we gave those tapes to Friends of Animals. I think,
Oh, I see.
if I can
Okay.
remember that correctly. I'm not sure how they knew that. That also kind of, you know, it gives me a little bit of pause because it makes me wonder if someone who was in my circle of friends talked with them. I, to the best of my memory, one night, this was very like a very scattershot effort. We knew one person that was a decent videographer, and myself, another individual, and this videographer boarded Ringling Brothers circus train. They would move the animals on a train from city to city. We boarded and we went from one city to the next with them. So we just essentially like most of the people sitting and keeping the animals company in each car were like migrant workers. Like they were, you know, a lot of folks that didn't speak English. And so we would just be friendly with them, wave to them, and just say, I think we lied and we said we're from like the ASPCA or something. We're here to document the treatment of the animals. And so most of them were like, oh, okay, just as long as you don't touch anything. And we just walked from train car to train car filming. And so some of that footage was used in presentations that Friends of Animals was doing and like legislative efforts from Friends of Animals. We gave that footage to Friends of Animals. I don't think it was for PETA.
I
In the
see.
past, I did work for PETA briefly. I don't think that footage overlapped PETA. I'm pretty sure it was Friends of Animals.
Gotcha. I think
But
in
like
the
I think at most we broke one padlock during that effort. So it wasn't like we engaged in wanton property destruction. We also got into no confrontations with anybody. We just had these like awkward conversations where someone like might not have fully understood what we were talking about. And we just said, oh, hey, yeah, we're here to inspect for the animals. Like just kind of lying, you know, and we just continued about what we were doing. And we filmed and we got off shortly before Manhattan. So we
yeah.
essentially boarded in Long Island and we got out just before the tunnel into Manhattan. That drive in total was like maybe 40 minutes we were on the train.
Interesting. Well, I mean, yeah, sort of jumping ahead to, you know, you were placed in this communication management unit, the CMU, secretive prison thing. And we'll talk about that a little later. But my question had been like, why you? And maybe this answers, excuse me, maybe this answers that question. Because it seemed like if you watch Animal People, the documentary, it would be like, why not? you would think they would put Kevin there or someone who was like more central to the SHAC campaign, but no, they put you in this tightly managed, for 6 months, had like very little communication with the outside world. And this is fascinating too, because I recently had Rod Coronado on. So I was watching old documentaries and stuff, and ended up watching a documentary about Daniel McGowan. And I know you shared your time with him in there. So I'd love to talk to you about that. But I don't want to jump too much, but I'm wondering if maybe it's the beagles or something, the rescued beagles, or this other stuff as to why they.
I don't think so. I think it was the writing while I was in prison. I was working on a book, and I did a few written interviews, and they seemed to really have a problem with some of the things I wrote.
I see.
Yeah, and what was fascinating too is I did not ever advocate for people pushing the limits of their direct action. I always talked about like that a diversity of tactics means that we challenge our own comfort, but it means we also don't use them as exclusionary devices where we say like, oh, this type of leafleting or this type of lobbying is the wrong tactic and my tactic is the right way. Like, no, it's actually all tactics, and I was trying to talk to the movement saying like, we shouldn't be so myopic and think, oh, this is this group of people that does things a certain way, and the people who don't do it exactly the way that we do it are somehow lesser than. Like, no, we're all adding to a collective bucket of trying to move things forward or push the envelope forward to make the world slightly better for animals.
Yeah.
And that's really what I was trying to articulate in some of the interviews that I did and the writings that I did.
By the way, I'm really glad you say that, because that is my view too. Like, we have a lot of infighting in our movement of what's the proper, what's the most effective, this thing, that thing. I don't know. None of us really have that answer, right? And I'm just really glad when someone's doing activism. So I'm glad that that's sort of the thing that you are articulating as well, even from a jail cell.
Yeah, and there was also some organizing I did on the prison compound itself that I think could have potentially informed their decision to choose me over other people to send to the CMU. But a lot of that is still unknown. There was a group of people who did a story for the Appeal and the Nation, and they seemed to surface some documents that it was the negligent death of my friend on the Butner prison yard, and me organizing the compound in response to the negligent death of my friend, that made the Federal Bureau of Prisons kind of very worried about my presence on the yard and said, get him off of the general population yard and put him in a high security setting. So even though I'd been programming and I had lowered my security classification points from medium down to low or minimum, and I should have qualified for a transfer closer to home. And for your audience, I was in a prison 690 miles from home, so I couldn't really see my loved ones the way that I had hoped. I was very fortunate to have a partner at the time that was driving down once every 2 weeks to see me, even if it was briefly. And that person, I credit them with saving my life, because they were there for me in that manner. But I was very far from home. I was trying to get closer to home. The judge in my case designated me to the low security prison at Fort Dix, which was about an hour from my home. And where I was in Butner, North Carolina, was about 14 or 16 hours from home. So it was pretty far. And I thought maybe I'd make my way back home. And when I eventually qualified for a transfer, they said, yeah, you're being transferred, but you're going to maximum security facility at Marion USP and not to the low security facility. I went further away. I went 1,800 miles from home as opposed to 600.
In Illinois. And then this was a place where, and maybe you should tell me, like, what, since you lived it, how limited your access to the outside world was, because that's the entire point of it, seems to be.
Yeah. So these are oversimplifications, but the way I've described it in the past is the CMU is a prison within the prison, right? So there's a larger prison penitentiary complex at USP Marion. It was a high security facility at the time. Before that, it was the nation's highest security facility before they built ADX in Colorado. It was downgraded from the Supermax to a high security facility. And then around 2003, I believe, they started to transition to what's called an FCI, Federal Correctional Institution. When a facility becomes a federal correctional institution, their staff can decrease by about half. And this is significant because they had originally tried to build units after 9/11 called CTUs, or counterterrorism units, to house people of quote unquote inspirational significance within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. That seems like a friendly word for political prisoner, right? And they brought this idea to Congress, and Congress shut it down. And they said, like, this cannot pass. This is not going to fly through the Administrative Procedures Act. And so they sidestepped the Administrative Procedures Act. What they decided to do is, we're going to take this maximum security facility at Terre Haute and this maximum security facility at Marion. We are going to take the most violent prisoners that are there and ship them out to other facilities. We're going to downgrade each facility to what's called an FCI, or a medium high security facility, but we're going to keep all the security structures in place. So things like the gun turrets, things like the extra fencing, things like the sensors, all those things are still in place. They then downgraded the staff proportionate to what an FCI should be, but they kept the budget the same. Then they took the budget that would have been for those extra 200 or so employees, and they routed it towards the construction budget of specialized units to build these CMUs, or communications management units. But if you go back and you FOIA early documentation, they refer to the units of the CTUs. So all they did was just shift around the names a little bit to make it more, make it seem as if it's a different program, but really it's the same exact program. And when they didn't get the budget, they just tweaked their own budget in order to make it work. Did I lose you? I think.
No, I'm still here.
Okay, so,
yeah.
So they took this extra budget, they built these facilities, and inside the Marion facility where I was, that was what was called the control unit. It used to be the highest security prison unit in the country. That was after they closed down Alcatraz. They took the nation's most notorious prisoners and they moved them to the Marion control unit. This is, if you could imagine, a pod inside of a building, inside of a larger prison, and that prison has a wall around it, but inside this pod and inside this building, there's another set of fences. Even the guards on their way in have to be double, triple checked before they enter the facility. Wow. The guards were instructed not to communicate with us. So unlike the other prison yards where we'd be out on the yard and you'd see a rec officer, you'd see an officer at the mess hall kind of nod at you or say, hey, you're taking too long eating your lunch. They'd blow a whistle and say, you got to make room for other guys to come in. Like there was regular interaction with guards at other facilities. At the CMU, they were told to have no contact whatsoever, which meant one day when someone had a medical emergency, it was extremely difficult trying to get them to administer any aid or get them to a hospital. It took hours because I see them on walkie-talkies outside scrambling, trying to figure out what's the protocol as a bunch of prisoners are trying to deal with a person who's having a seizure and might be having a stroke in front of us, trying to scream to get this person help, right? You could see that bureaucracy almost broke down the ability for them to help that individual on the other side of the gates. It's also what led to, and I'm just trying to talk about this in very clinical terms, but I think his name was David Lane, one of the leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood. I believe he wrote a book that was inspirational to most of the American alt-right. He had a heart attack at the CMU Terre Haute. And because of a very similar situation where they didn't know how to send people in, he died on the floor of the CMU Terre Haute. Which is not to say that this doesn't happen in other facilities. I had a cellmate at Butner who died of a heart attack. And there was a similar bureaucracy because they wanted to bring a ambulance out onto the yard. He was playing touch football when he died. And it was just you know, 20, 30 minutes that passed before they could even get permission for the ambulance to get in through the gates. At that point, he had already passed, right?
Wow.
So I'm not saying it's like that unique, but it was a different vibe entirely. It was
Yeah.
like the guards were afraid to talk to us because they were afraid of getting indicted.
Yeah.
And they were also trained different. There wasn't that hostility you felt from the guards. It was clearly a different world. Like there was a little elevator thing that looked like a dumbwaiter, and the CMU was partially level with the ground. The other portion of it was recessed like a story or two into the ground, like a cellar of sorts.
Mm.
And I remember when food would arrive at the CMU, a prisoner for the general complex would push it into a gate, and then the guards would push the cart with all the food past that gate into what was essentially the upstairs of the CMU, where it went into like this little dumbwaiter or elevator. And then it would come down and come out to us. And there was an imam for the group named Nuruddin Abdi. And he was kind of like the self-appointed, we're going to make sure everyone gets a fair cut of food. But we were taking care of each other, right? Like, so Nuruddin would bring out the food cart and people would come with their bowls or their trays, and he'd try to make sure that everyone got an even portion, you know, that there wouldn't be any favoritism for the Muslims or the white guys or whoever.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's very different than thinking about the way other facilities run, where there's like a guard essentially looking over your shoulder or whatever else. Like they just left it entirely up to us. It was very experimental.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've seen you talk about this before, and it's pretty fascinating. You say like there's like this camaraderie that you guys all had. It sounds like it worked out well with the prisoners that you were in there with. Although on the flip side of that, I could totally see how that could go entirely wrong if you didn't have that level of person, that
Mm-hmm.
quality of character of person. Yeah, it's really interesting. You kind of describe like that was almost like a more pleasant place to be. Now, that's not including the part where
It
you
was
can't.
restrictive and sad in that I couldn't speak to people back home.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna
So
say.
that weighed heavy on you. Like it had a strong psychological impact.
Right.
However, it was also, well, for those years that for the time period I was there, it was much less violent than the prison in North Carolina. If you could imagine, the prison in North Carolina was, I think, as many as 2,000 people on my compound, spread out across multiple buildings with a shared yard, shared educational center, shared art room and library, and a factory where everyone worked. And at any given moment, you know, there could be as many as 1,500 people walking back and forth from the chow hall or to the whatever. They do these periodic moves, right? But you'd see that many people walking at one moment or the next.
Mhm.
And there could be as many as like 500 people out on the yard, and there might be a hip hop cipher or, you know, like some folks gambling, and something goes wrong, and all of a sudden it turns into a much bigger thing because it's such a large group of people, and those group of people far outnumber the number of guards that are there.
Yeah.
So there was a lot more that could happen on those yards. There was a lot more that I had to constantly keep my head on a swivel about. I refused to click up with the prominent white guys on the compound in North Carolina, and that led to a lot of discord, especially in the beginning, until I kind of got settled in. I think what ended up helping me in the long run was I was tutoring people, and I did not discriminate against like the dirty white boys and those gangs that would come for help with Microsoft Office or whatever. And I remember one time after getting into a fight with some of these white guys, I was tutoring one of them, and he's like, "Why are you helping me?" I was like, "Because I don't want to see you come back. You know, all
Mm.
this that's around us is oppression. And if you can get a skill that prevents you from coming back into prison, like, man, like that's what I want for you, and that's what you should want for yourself." And he said something, and pardon my French, am I allowed to cuss?
Yeah, yeah,
He's like,
totally.
yo, man, I'm sorry. I think we got you fucked up. Like, that's what he
Mhm.
said to me. Like, as if they thought like maybe I was there to create like chaos because I was not adhering to the script of how white people should behave on the compound.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
they also, I mean, their eventual reasoning for saying I don't need to comply was kind of hysterical. They decided I was mixed. And once they decided I was mixed, the rules didn't apply anymore. I was like, this
Nice.
is the silliest rules. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
um, and I'm half Armenian, quarter Irish, quarter Yugoslavian. My grandmother lived in Haifa and Cairo, Egypt before coming to the United States. I don't know,
Mhm.
whatever. If they had to call me half Arab in order to then not have me be part of their clique and I somehow was able to be a free agent, I'm
Yeah.
fine with
Yeah.
it, you know?
Yeah. I feel like I didn't know we were going to talk this much about the prison experience at this point. I kind of wanted to give like a bit of a disclaimer that we're not trying to make people afraid. The last thing that I want my podcast to do would be to encourage people to stop doing activism.
Absolutely.
I know that's how you feel too.
I mean, I'll just say this, I'm still here.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing
Yeah.
they could have done to me to make me want to abandon my ethics,
Right.
right?
Right.
And at the end of the day, I also know that when they try things like this, they try to do it to one or two people, one or two prominent people that they're hoping would then talk about their experience writ large, and a lot of other people will feel the trepidation of it. Usually, when they crack down on movements, they don't crack down on everybody. They go after a handful of people that they think are at the top of a totem pole, and they're hoping that everything will trickle down and lead to trepidation or a chilling aspect to the movement that would
Yeah.
lead to inaction. And so you're right. Often talking about this in great detail could make people nervous, but the likelihood of you ending up in this situation is minimal. And if it does happen, you know, our movement is really good at taking care of their own. When it comes to letter writing, sending books, like, um, making you feel like a folk hero, even though I don't think it's healthy to do that. Like, people
Hmm.
take care of the prisoners. And so just know that people will love you and will take care of you and will not abandon you when you go in there. And I could say that that's one of the reasons why I am alive right now is
Hmm.
people took care of me. I met a lot of friends along the way, inside and out. But, without getting into great detail, Brian Dinkeldine, publisher from North Carolina, who I have tremendous admiration for, he started coming once a week because his house was near the prison in North Carolina.
Hmm.
And we would just share snacks from the vending machine and talk about activism. And every single time that happened, it was like this reprieve from everything that was going on inside the compound. And it was just this like window to freedom on the outside.
Yeah.
Letters were windows of freedom of sorts.
Yeah.
When I got out, I ended up doing a kind of DIY public relations project called the Sparrow Project. And that was written in part by the little birds that used to sit on the razor wire. And I'd be so enamored with them as they kind of bobbed and weaved through this dangerous razor wire. They were little symbols of freedom. And they became a metaphor for the public affairs work that I was doing by trying to find activists that could not afford a publicist and get them the communications help and support that they needed, because I saw them as little symbols of freedom. And that's what the Sparrow Project name came from, was
Mhm.
this idea that like little things came into the prison, whether that be letters or visits or friends or birds that kind of weave between the dangerous razor wire and gave me reasons to continue to feel inspired despite these really harsh circumstances that I was in. And they kept my head up, and I'm just trying to pay it forward.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like you said, there's this tendency to look at people like they're folk heroes. There's also just this extreme amount of gratitude that people like me will have for you for life, for doing that, for putting yourself out there. So that's one thing to hang your hat on, at least, you have like support. And
But I also need to humble. I don't mean to push back because I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to make sure that people feel safe out there and that it's not the
Mhm.
end of the world. But I'm
Yeah.
just a regular person.
Yeah,
Like,
no,
there's
yeah.
nothing about me that's a folk hero. There's nothing about me that knows better or is more experienced. If anything, the only value that I've added to this movement is to say, like, I'm going to sound really self-deprecating, but like an inarticulate guy who had a learning disability all throughout high school was able to kind of put a dent in a multinational corporation. If I could do it with all your smarts and all your talent and all your creativity, you could do so much more. Right. And I'm not trying to say I'm like incompetent either. Like, I know that sometimes comes across as self-deprecating and not the most flattering thing to say about myself, but it's true. I don't think I have more skills than anybody else. And
Well,
so, yeah, don't view me as a folk hero. I'm just a
yeah,
guy.
I had John Curtin on, and John had that same feedback. In fact, he pushed back pretty hard on it. He was saying, you know, he viewed it as like disempowering that we call these people who did direct action back in the 90s and early 2000s like they're heroes. And he said, like he was talking about Barry Horn, and he was saying like, Barry would laugh at that. He's like, we're not heroes. And he says it's disempowering. You create it like you romanticize it. It's something that only heroes can do. So it makes ordinary people like me and you feel like maybe we can't do that. Puts me in a little bit of an awkward position because like I have so much reverence for people like that. So I think you can kind of do both. I think that's where I've landed, because I sometimes like get into this where I'm like gushing over the person that I've brought on. That's because I have so much admiration. At the same time, transferring that admiration to, you out there watching, and just making you realize that, yes, you too are this person. You too can be this person. It's just some decision that you make. And I'm not saying go out and break laws. I'm saying do, the thing that makes you feel great, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I
Or,
mean, I would cheerlead this instead of encouraging people to do a specific type of action. Find a way to challenge your comfort zone. That might not mean going out and doing this over the top illegal thing. It might mean, instead of leafleting 1 day a week, leafleting 3 days a week. If you're already leafleting 3 days a week and you're in a place in life where you could take nonviolent, strategic, direct action against something or do a civil disobedience, consider doing that. If you're already doing things like that and you feel like you could face, anywhere from 1 to 7 years in prison, and you want to go free a bunch of animals from a laboratory or a place of abuse, by all means, go do it. But no one's telling you like you should just do that one thing.
right.
Instead, it's that animals, the environment, and people that are in repressive, horrible situations need advocacy. And no one else is going to do it. We have to do it, right? Like,
Right.
you can't wait for that, as you described, superhero from the past to return.
Right.
Because
Right.
there is no superhero from the past. There's only the people that we share our space with right now, each
Right.
other. You go turn to the person to your left, and they're easily the next liberation waiting to happen. You can look inward and you could be that person. It really all depends, right? And
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that anybody who doesn't rise to that occasion is somehow subpar. No, don't beat yourself up. Just figure out, is there a little bit more you could be doing? And is there a way that you could chip in, right?
Yeah.
Or support someone who did take that risk, because
Yeah.
there's a role in that as well. So I think that it doesn't need to be one thing or the other. And for the FBI listening, like, it doesn't need to be just breaking in and freeing animals either. It's
Yeah.
it's a collection of
Thanks for the
all.
views, though, FBI. I appreciate
Yeah. Thanks for
that.
those 2 views or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I would say this, like, this is obviously an animal rights channel, but what you're saying, Andy, I feel like that applies to life. Pushing your comfort zone, trying things out, is something that I advocated for at the very beginning of my channel, because I had spent this like year back when I had lost a job, lost a girlfriend. And that was when I went vegan also and was starting to play music. I spent a whole year deliberately reinventing myself. But really the reinvention was, as you said, just putting myself in positions that, just nudged my comfort zone a little further and further to where I could do bolder and greater things, basically. So yeah, so that's a really great theme. You know, we jumped around so much, but maybe we should go back again, back to the, you know, to the early days again, because we kind of jumped from there to prison. And so you talked about doing, you know, work with the ADL, the Animal Defense League, and maybe tell me how you started to get, because you mentioned, you know, the environmental activism. How did you start to transition from environmental activism? Maybe you still did environmental activism, but got more into animal stuff.
So I think I know it definitely galvanized during my first year of college. There was a group that I became involved with on campus called Youth for Justice. It was kind of like a intersectional all issues group. And there was a guy that worked at the campus coffee house, and he went by Vegan Bill. And Vegan Bill put the first vegan outreach flyer in my hand. So this was freshman year, 1996, fall of 1996. And I remember trying to be vegan in the fall of 1996, stumbling a little bit around Christmas, I believe, where my grandmother cooked something. And she's like, well, I know you don't eat meat, but like, I think she made eggplant Parmesan instead of chicken Parmesan for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I ate that, felt guilty. And it was the national meat out in March of the following year that I'm like, that's it. Like, I'm done entirely.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't like I was regularly, I think I had like one or two things that weren't vegan during that time period.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't want to have anything like that. And I had met through the Youth for Justice group, Darius Fulmer.
Okay, Darius,
my co-defendant, yeah. And they had invited me down to a protest outside the Yerkes Primate Center, and I couldn't make it because of something to do with school. And I had heard, because things were not very online at that point. It was all like we were just calling each other. We had beepers, you know, like that kind of thing. And so there was chatter in the music scene that the thing at Yerkes was going to be big, but we didn't know how big, right? And I remember really regretting missing it because it was the wildest protest I think I've ever seen in the animal rights movement. And no animals were liberated, but it was like the whole Yerkes primate facility got like bum rushed by people.
Wow.
And it was in Georgia. I ended up not going. I saw Darius and Justin Taylor at an event in New York City. And they are like, are you vegan yet? And I was like, yeah, I'm vegan now. And they're like, all right, you know, we don't need to add you to that list or something. Like I said, right, totally the wrong reasons for initially becoming vegan. I shouldn't allow like two dudes to peer pressure me into doing it. I should make an informed decision. But I did, and
But it was meat out.
It was the meat out around that time. But they were so obnoxious with their activism. I'm surprised that like they got under my skin, you know, it wasn't less Darius, but like Justin, he was just, I knew Justin from high school, by the way. Like,
oh, really?
I knew him before any of this, as just some skater kid in the town I grew up in. Yeah. So like, it was interesting to kind of have it all come full circle. And this conversation was happening in Connecticut. We weren't at home anymore. Darius was from New Jersey. We were at a meeting in Connecticut. Justin was now living in New York City. He was going to NYU, and I continued living in Long Island. So we somehow all met each other in Connecticut at this other summit. And that's when we started figuring out like, well, how are we going to get more involved? For about another year, things were still a little bit tenuous because I was an intern at the Wetlands Activism Center, which was a show space in New York City that funded activism. And so the work that we were doing was trying to like incubate all this variety of groups. So there'd be like anti-racist groups one day, forest defense work the next day, animal rights group on like Thursdays. Like it was just always funding and trying to support different groups by way of routing the show money that was happening through there. And I loved that experience. I met a lot of amazing artists while working there. Like the Roots would hang out in my office. remember meeting the rapper Eve, Jill Scott, Erica Badu. Like it was just really interesting, nice experience to be able to work there. But it was also, it's funny because it was associated with the hippie stuff, right? And Justin and all them like would scoff at it. So there was this strange tension in our circle of friends. Was like, are you with the hippies or are you with us? Because they were all from that hardcore scene. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So I had always like floated around, and it wasn't until I got arrested doing ALF stuff that they really started paying attention to me, being like, wait, you did you get arrested? Like, and they started supporting me for the stuff I got in trouble for. I had a good like 2-year streak of no one knowing who I was, just like breaking first shop windows and spray painting McDonald's. Like I had this 1 year where I worked at a restaurant, and I told myself I could not go to sleep at night unless I did one direct action before I went to bed. So like all low level stuff, but I would always do one thing before I went to bed as a promise to myself. And that streak went on for a while, but the moment I got caught for one of them, it was like the dominoes started falling. And at that point, that's when all the groups kind of chimed in, was like, how can we help you? How can we support? I started doing more stuff with the ADL. And I think my profile as an activist grew from there because people were talking about the arrest that I experienced early on.
I see. I mean, and that's another thing, you know, not to glorify arrests or anything, but they can have this kind of like springboard effect, it sounds like.
Yeah. I think I was arrested like 18 or 20 times before the SHAC arrest.
Really? Wow.
So it all happened in like a 2-year period.
What were how were you getting arrested that many times? I guess you were just bad at not getting caught, right?
So no. Like I said, I had like a 2-year streak of not getting caught at all. And then I was charged with 1 count of graffiti, but then they went back and they like looked at the hand styles on this one graffiti, and they're like, okay, we're now going to charge you with 80 counts of it. And then I got brought back in because at the first demonstration outside of Huntingdon Life Sciences, somebody had pushed through the gates wearing a backpack that they borrowed from my house that I incidentally was the same backpack I used in high school. So it had my name written inside of it.
Yeah.
And they had like bolt cutters and other things in that backpack. And so that person was facing an indictment for breaking and entering. They cooperated and they said, oh, Andy's responsible for going after this farm. Andy smashed the windows of the following first shops. I was there with him, and they took a deal about that. So I did 90 days in jail first for some broken first shop windows. I did 4 months for some graffiti that ran concurrent with, I think it was a probation violation for another ALF type accusation. Ended up doing 11 months. And this was all prior to getting arrested for the SHAC thing.
Oh, wow. I didn't know all that.
Yeah.
Okay. So like, how did you get started doing like ALF? Like what was the catalyst for you to start doing those types of actions?
I don't quite remember what the first thing was. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think it was putting a first shop out of business in my hometown. I would repeatedly break the windows of this first shop in my hometown, and finally they went out of business. And I remember that the day they closed, having this feeling of like, this is the opposite of what I was experiencing doing the environmental activism. I remember when I was 13 or 14, lobbying for various laws related to pesticide use on Long Island. And I kind of dedicated that work to my friend Elida's mother, who passed away from cancer. And I had a bit of a shock working on that stuff as a teenager, because I had this sense of urgency, and I didn't realize like just how pathetic it feels to pull at the pant legs of your legislators, asking them to pass something called the Neighborhood Notification Act, where like if someone puts like an organochlorine or something down on their lawn to kill bugs, that they should put up a sign so that way like people's pets and babies won't touch that grass and potentially be exposed to carcinogenic or xenoestrogen type chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And it took like 3 years to pass the Neighborhood Notification Act, right? And I'm like, it's fucking putting a sign on someone's lawn. Like this is not costing anyone anything. Like I thought I was like shooting for something gettable.
Yeah.
And so working at like 13, 14, I just got more and more angry. And then come 17 or 18, I'm like, I put a fur shop out of business in a summer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just something to kind of sit with. And I'm not glorifying that, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
It was just this idea that like I made a decision to put them out of business and they went out of business.
Yeah.
I could replicate this.
Right.
And I think I kind of got addicted to the idea of like, I could do this again. I could do this again. I could do this again. And I started winning a lot, both doing direct actions, but then also started winning more with tactical stuff in the above ground.
Mm-hmm.
My biggest mistake for people listening is that I used to wear more than one hat, right? I, at one point, was asked by David Barbaresh of the Animal Liberation Front press office if I'd be a spokesperson for the press office here in the United States. Probably one of the stupidest things I've ever done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he'd call me and say, oh, we received a communique that like 15 McDonald's had their windows broken in Long Island. Would you be willing to talk to ABC about this? And so I said, yeah, sure. And I'm talking about the actions I did the night prior in the third person, like a
Mm-hmm.
crazy person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it was leading to me. I actually believe that I like created a form of mental illness in myself, that I was able to talk about these things abjectly from the outside, saying we neither condone nor condemn what these individuals did, but this is what the animals are experiencing and this is what's motivating the ALF. I'm talking about it as if that thing is this foreign entity that I have no idea what it is, and it was me the night prior.
Mm-hmm.
It just was stupid. And I think one of the biggest bits of advice I can give to people that listen here is that if you're going to do underground action, stay in the underground. If you're going to do above ground action, stay in the above ground. And every time you try to braid the two, and by the way, this happens a lot in our movements because we're so spread thin, but every single time that you braid the two, it is a security nightmare waiting to explode. Like you're bound to trip yourself up.
Mm-hmm.
And I was lucky for several years that it didn't trip me up. But like once one domino started falling, a bunch started falling.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what was the moment that you were like going after the first shop? Like so you had this rage, like, so for one thing, we're learning from you that basically like, you were trying this legislative approach. It just wasn't working. It just wasn't working fast enough.
It wasn't working fast enough based on
Yeah.
my mindset as a 13, 14-year-old.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, nowadays I understand the bureaucracy and how long things take. And I'm not saying it's okay. It's not okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely not okay. But my young mind couldn't deal with that at all. My idyllic mind couldn't deal with that at all. I wasn't cynical enough yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, where did the rage for the fur animals come from? It sounds like you already had a sense like there is wrong being done, and were you already like a vegan at this point? Were you like steeped in animal rights at that point?
Yeah, like I went vegan when I was 17, going on 18.
Mm-hmm.
Probably those first shop things were about age 19. If I have to, I might be off by a year or so, but it was around age 19 that I started doing that stuff a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to ask me at that time where the rage was coming from, I would probably give you a more direct answer that like, do you know that, 50 animals go into a single fur coat? And do you know that animals are anally and vaginally electrocuted or gassed, that they're living these lives out in these fur farms where they're getting this paralysis in the cage because they're used to traveling upwards of 14 to 25 miles a day while foraging for food, and they can't travel that distance anymore. So they become psychotic and they do flips around their cage. That's probably the answer I'd give you in that year. Looking back on it now as an adult that's like been a little bit more reflexive, I experienced some abuse as a child. And I remember now that I've been doing a lot of therapy, in part because of things to do with prison and unrelated. And I know we didn't get into this, but like I was very involved with the organizing against fascism in Charlottesville, and a young woman was killed and she died at my feet, and it really just messed me up. Right. So I've been dedicating a big portion of my life to therapy, trying to, make myself a better person.
This woman, Heather, right?
Heather higher, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know
I did
Heather.
not know her prior to that. I ended up becoming friends with her mom after the fact, but I did not know her prior to that happening. I was actually inside a shop on that street writing the victory press release for the protesters when the car came down and hit everybody. And there was someone assigned to my security who was outside with the protesters. And the first thing I saw was like a bone sticking out of their jeans because they had gotten hit. And I think one of the things that I struggled with the most is I've always been someone who's thrust myself into the middle of stuff. I've never been like the person off to the side, protected and privileged. And when I walked out into a group of people where everyone was hurt, we're talking dozens of people hurt, bleeding out in the street, and then I watched Heather die, I just almost wished that I was hurt too, like as if like, why was I protected from all this? And it was really hard for me to deal with, and it still is, right? It's still really, really hard for me to do. Between everything from prison to everything else, like I don't think anything ever was as bad as what I saw there, right? And so I've been doing a lot of therapy, and I know this conversation sounds like it's jumping around, but therapy made me think a lot about my formative years, right? As does for most therapists, they take that route.
Yeah.
And I had a neighbor who was a police officer who abused his son and me. I don't know all the details about the abuse because my memory is spotty, but I remember he used to, some of this abuse is sexual in nature. Again, I don't want to get into great details, A, content warning, and B, because I don't remember fully what it was. But I remember one of the most caustic things that he ever did was that my father worked at a bank. My father was a vet, and he would come home and he'd be very quiet, and he would go out to his garden and spend most of the time in the garden after work. And this guy, who was an authority figure, a police officer, right, used to talk shit about my dad to me and say stuff like, my dad's not a real man. And this is what like a real man looks like. A real man will pass a football with his son. And that like, he could show me what a real man looks like, and those kinds of things, and teach me to be a better man. And I remember the anger I felt for two reasons. He drove a wedge between me and my dad probably until I was well into my teens, right? Where I felt that my dad didn't care about me, or my dad was too distant. I didn't realize that was my dad coping between work and everything else. My dad was blind in one eye. My dad had been in the Defense Intelligence Agency before, working at that bank. This was his downtime coming home from work, right? Yeah, you can maybe criticize my dad, his answer to having a communication with my son is like, here's $20, go get dinner with your friends, because he doesn't really know how to have a longer conversation. But he was a good person, right? He was a good person. You have this guy who's the neighbor essentially telling me he's not a man, he's not this, he's not that. And I'm 5, 6 years old, right? Like, and he's an authority figure. He's a police officer. He left me feeling suffocated, confused about like my relationship with my family. Like, is he the example of something that is proper? And am I somehow in a deficit? Like, am I not man enough, or does my dad not care about me? Why can't I talk to my dad about these things I experienced over here? Like, he was essentially playing with my head to not talk about the things that I experienced back at that house.
Yeah.
And about a year or so later, the Exxon Valdez spill happened. And I remember seeing a National Geographic, and the cover of the National Geographic was waterfowl, like a duck or a cormorant, covered with oil. And I remember flipping through the pages and seeing all these animals covered with oil. And all I wanted to do was get to Alaska to help these animals. Now, obviously I couldn't. I was like 7 or 8 or whatever years old. I was not old enough to get myself to Alaska and to help clean animals. But I remember there's a field behind my parents' house, and I remember walking out to the field with the National Geographic, and at 8 or 9 years old, breaking down and crying and I'm sorry, man, and promising that I would do something to help those animals.
Mm-hmm.
And this is before I was even vegetarian, right? Like, it was this strange connection, and it's very difficult to talk about even now. But I realized that in those moments, it was the same kind of suffocation I felt because I wasn't talking to my parents about what was going on or what happened, that I was seeing in those animals. And that was the initial connection. And so, like, when you ask me where that rage was coming from, I probably at 19 years old would not answer you in the clearest way. I'd answer you in, like, here's the clinical way of answering, without even unpacking any of this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember getting detained by cops as a teenager and fighting them off. Like, I would never recommend anyone do that, right? Like, that to me is insane and a recipe for getting shot, right? And I don't think in those moments I even understood where, like, my fear and anger and all these things were coming from, that it all kind of started at this one place. It also, now that I'm older, makes me think I'm just a really mundane guy, because it just took a guy doing something terrible to a mundane kid to make him identify with these lesser creatures. Maybe I would never have made that connection had I not been subject to something like that at a young age.
Mm.
And so I don't say it as a form of self-deprecation. I say it as like I stumbled into this worldview and I didn't realize what was causing it. And now that I'm older, I'm starting to understand it a little bit better. But at the end of the day, I don't regret any of the decisions I made.
Right.
You know, anything
Right.
that freed an animal, anything that helped people, anything that pushed back against fascism, anything that advocated for a family whose loved one was gunned down by a police officer, I have zero regrets throwing myself into those issues. The only details that I regret are if I miscalculated anything that could have led to a situation where someone could have had a touch point with the law or could have inadvertently gotten hurt. And that was one of the things that I grappled with the most in Charlottesville. It was always this internal monologue. Well, if I did this, or this different, maybe that car would not have come down that street, or maybe Heather wouldn't have been there, or, you know, like all these different factors. And I understand it's not my fault. I didn't drive that car down that street, but that's where my brain starts going. And I'm sorry if this conversation is kind of all over the place.
No.
What you're trying to do.
Well, to be honest, I mean, like, that's my job, is to kind of keep the conversation. And I realize that we have so much to discuss that we're just not going to do that. And I feel like that's kind of better in a way, that it can be messy. Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, you're trying to unpack, like, how you had this compassion for animals, and we're doing that with ourselves all the time, because we're trying to understand, why don't these people have this compassion for animals, and why is it that we've been able to? So it's interesting that maybe you can pinpoint, like, one of those reasons why this police officer, and then also this officer, like, you know, abusing his power, you know, giving you that sort of lesson at a young age, that people in authority positions are not always good people, that they abuse their power. It's interesting too, like, that would have, like, it's funny because not funny, but it's interesting that you didn't get into it, you know, through the hardcore scene, like you said, a lot of your friends did. Whereas, like, this background of yours with this police officer, I could see you, like, going hard into this, like, fuck the system, you know, fuck authority, rage against the machine kind of mentality. And it sounds like you didn't, like, immediately go that route, but then you got there, obviously.
Yeah. I think I actually have, I try not to speak definitively about anything, and I try not to embolden myself to say I have answers. but I feel like there's an answer in collapsing the distance between yourself and whatever it is you're trying to feel empathetic about. And I think for my personal experience, I think someone else collapsed that distance for me, right? But I think that all of us need to collapse that distance. And there are rhetorical tools and ways that we create distance between ourselves and other things, right? I can make a overbroad example here. Calling a piece of chicken a cutlet and having a cutlet in a styrofoam package that's sanitized in the store is a way of creating distance between mother chicken and the consumer. It's calling it a side of beef or calling it brisket or calling it something other than what it is, a mother cow, is creating distance. When you have two groups of people, and I'm sorry to jump into this issue, but it's current, when you have two groups of people that are, if they are Semitic Jews, right, like that are living in Israel, that have indigeneity to the region, and Palestinians that are Semitic, that are indigenous to the region, and you look at that bloodline, there is literally no distance between those two people. It is their ethnic upbringing that has created that distance. It is the rhetoric devices that are coming from ultranationalists in Israel that are essentially describing people on the other side of a fence or a border as animalistic or as others. They understand that by creating that distance between yourself and your neighbor, you create space to other them, to demonize them, to cast them out, and eventually do the worst things for them, right? So every time you other something else, it's a predicate to abuse. And we do that the utmost with animals. We do it with the environment. We have rapacious attitudes towards the environment. You know, we don't call a forest, we call it a stand when we cut it down, right? We come up with different terms for it, right? And I think the idea is that by creating that distance, it's like we give ourselves permission to act differently to that other than we would if we felt that proximity, that closeness. And so one would need to ask themselves, well, how do we collapse the distance between ourselves and everything? What if we're all collectively on this earth together, that we all have inherent worth, that I'm a person who's spiritual, but the people who are listening might not be spiritual. Like, you know, I believe that we're all God's children, animals, plants, humans. We all have this inherent worth. God never gave us dominion over anything. Or if there is the word dominion, it's stewardship and kindness, that we live and coexist alongside them peacefully. And the first thing that we need to do to get to that place is collapse that distance. And so I'm not saying I have an answer. And this is also just very like metaphoric and very kind of top level philosophic, but by reducing that distance between ourselves and that farmed animal, we're more likely to feel empathetic to it. By reducing the distance between the people that are in the kibbutzim and the people who are in Gaza, which is maybe a distance of what, 5-6 miles? By collapsing that physical distance, by collapsing that distance in the neighbors and having a conversation or sharing a meal, all of a sudden committing genocide against that individual seems so much more abhorrent. And it's a two-way street too, right? Like a degree of dehumanization had to happen in order for people to feel morally justified to do October 7th, right? And this is not me saying the Palestinians aren't justified in their self-defense. I fully believe they are. But before you commit violence, you have to create distance between yourself and your quote-unquote enemy. If you collapse that distance, you're going to have a very hard time hating or committing violence against that individual. If we collapse that distance between ourselves and animals, we have a very hard time thinking about the thing that we're about to kill and consume. There's so many people that if you were to stop them on the street and ask them if they would go kill this lamb and then consume it, they wouldn't do it. But they would gladly consume something that's in, you know, souvlaki or a pho or whatever that they're going to have at their dinner that night.
Yeah.
Because that distance has been created for them and it's convenient. But if you collapse that distance, then people are going, most people have a propensity to be good.
Yeah.
And if you collapse that distance, they will feel that empathy. The idea is, how do we break down these walls so people let themselves feel empathetic? And then from a PR and marketing standpoint, I've learned that forcing people to be empathetic doesn't work. You have to bring them to their own empathy. That could happen through storytelling. That could happen through outreach. That doesn't mean that direct action doesn't have a place also. It does. Sometimes direct action is just about hurting the bottom line of the animal abusers. Other times it's about inspiring the public. It really all depends on what the individual direct action is for. But that can't exist in a vacuum by itself. We also have to create empathy and collapse that distance between ourselves and animals at the same time. And so it requires like everybody. I hope I didn't jump around too much with that answer. I hope I
No, it was beautiful. And in fact, I mean, we're sort of off your story, but maybe it's a good time to talk about, and maybe you're a good person to speak to this. So you brought up the issue that I think is roiling the animal rights movement right now, honestly, more than anything, and that's the issue of Gaza. And I wonder if you can speak to this demonization that I'm seeing people do to each other, activist to activist, because they believe this way or that way on that issue. I feel like what you've just described is happening, with deadly consequences in the Middle East. We're doing with obviously not deadly consequences in the movement, but we're damaging the movement by otherizing each other, one activist to another. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's two things. The one is the human nature component, which is this kind of act of being tribal and othering your opposition and then creating that distance. And then at that point, communication and solidarity breaks down, right? So that's part of the human nature aspect of it. But added to that is now an artificial element, and that is recommendation algorithms in social media, right? Recommendation algorithms in social media by default serve people what they think the person wants to hear or see, and inadvertently create silos and echo chambers. And so individuals on two sides of that issue are going to be surrounded by affirming content that makes them more galvanized in that position. And in many ways, it throws gas on these fires, right? So I don't think it's practical to think that the movement's going to come offline anytime soon.
Right.
I had been, and unrelated to this conversation, but in my day job and my work, I have been advocating for reverse chronological order on social platforms for about 10 years, and to try to create regulation that would stop recommendation algorithms. It is a quixotic venture. I think I've just been met with scoffing and people saying none of the platforms ever do that because the algorithms are their lifeblood. But I think that we need to detangle ourselves from our social lives on social media, because it's amplifying the outrage. It's making people more hyperpolarized, right? Yeah. And so that's throwing gas on this issue that you're talking about. It's happening and touching some of my friends here in New York right now. People are going to feel passionately about it, and rightfully so, right? We are looking at anywhere from 70,000 to 250,000 people who have been killed since 2023. And that is not to undercut the suffering that people experienced on October 7th, because that suffering is real also. What we're seeing in the fallout of October 7th far eclipses anything that happened that day. And if we were doing pure numbers, we're looking at about an October 7th every 4 days or so happening in Gaza in terms of the amount of people that are killed. And so I think people do need to speak up. I think people do need to advocate. And I think that it is congruent with us as being vegans to kind of reach into a deep well of empathy and to understand that that empathy extends to all beings. Those are the beings in Gaza, and no matter how incongruent it sounds with our messaging, it extends to people in Israel as well. Now, someone who wants to pick apart this conversation and say, oh, well, he's both sidesing. I'm not both sidesing. What I'm saying is suffering is real. That suffering informs their decisions. People become more recalcitrant. And when they become more recalcitrant, the cycle of violence goes on and on and on. The question is, how do we interrupt that, right? People need to be unapologetic in their support of Palestine. But I also think they need to have open arms and have robust, kind dialogue with people who don't think like them. And that part is going to sound too milquetoast for a lot of activists that are new to this issue. I've been doing Palestine solidarity activism since the 90s, right? And this is not me trying to say like I know better, because I don't have any answers, right? I've been doing Palestine solidarity activism since the 90s. My close friend, Kristen Shore, was shot by the IDF while delivering lentils into the church in Nativity. I remember being so angry and kind of going down these rabbit holes of rage myself, especially when my friend, who was someone who used to visit me while I was incarcerated, was shot. And this was during the time I was incarcerated for FUR stuff, not for the SHAC stuff, but she came to visit me in Nassau County Correctional Facility as well as Riverhead. And it was between her stays in the Middle East. And she was shot by the IDF. And I remember reading about it in the paper and just being so stressed out, and very little I can do while being incarcerated, right? And so the issue was always polarizing for me in my life. But now I watch as people who are new to the issue, that are seeing stuff online, that are seeing their feeds just flooded with hyperbolic content on both sides, right? So if you happen to be someone who is consuming Zionist content, you're going to be getting more and more and more of that content from some actors that might not be the most truthful or the most honest, or be coming from a place of good faith. And then if you're pro-Palestine and you're regularly posting pro-Palestine content, whether that be on TikTok, it's less on Meta, but you're going to be getting more and more affirming content in your feed because the feed thinks that's what you want to see. And so it leads to you not broadening your horizons. It leads to, in a particular issue where people are on both sides of a fence, pointing and hating at each other, it leads to no opportunity for commingling and discussion. And commingling and discussion is going to be the only path forward out of this conflict, right? But anything short of military intervention from the West against Israel, which I don't foresee happening, right? So where I think we need to discuss is, we need to discuss amongst each other and with our neighbors, why are there things like 5 tiers of citizenship in Israel, right? How is a group of people able to separate other groups of people into 5 categories, give them varying rights, give them the ability to drive on certain roads or not drive on certain roads? How are you creating this distinction? It's a very technical, bureaucratic process for the same othering we spoke about before, right? How do we have a discussion about that with people that might not be ready to hear it yet, that the same mechanisms that we do to animals, by creating distance between ourselves and those animals, by othering those animals, are happening in a body politic in Israel right now? And in addition to that, how do we police our own to not dehumanize people who were born in Israel, dehumanize people who are Jewish, and dehumanize people that might have Zionist light sentiments because that's the way they were brought up? They're going to need to be talked to and shown love and compassion and hearing their stories at the same time. Otherwise, they're never going to change, right? So I think a lot of the infighting that you're seeing right now is it's completely counterproductive, especially for the animal rights movement that should remain focused on animals, right? But then when discussions do happen around intersectionality, It should be, we are a movement that operates from a deep well of empathy. And we cannot let our empathy be turned on and off indiscriminately for different groups of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you feel empathy for the children who are starving in Gaza, also try to hold space for the people who died on October 7th. And if you are still thinking about the people who have been abused and murdered on October 7th, and you think that is the only crime that is happening, right? Try to broaden your circle of compassion to think about the fallout and the regular people that live in Gaza. Try to think about the information that you're consuming and understand that no, not everybody who lives in Gaza is a Hamas sympathizer, right? And even though some people engage in, fighting as part of the Ummah or fighting with Palestinian Islamic Jihad or others, they are fighting back against repression that they've experienced for decades. That doesn't make you, who is an Israeli, an evil person. The only thing it does is it says there's a responsibility that you have to try to restore justice, right? It doesn't mean that you were born evil. It doesn't mean that your faith is bad. It doesn't mean any of those things. It means you have a place at the table to try to make the situation better. And sadly, I think people in their tribalistic ways have a tendency to reduce this down to something like sports teams, like red team versus blue team. And the moment you're not on the red team or the blue team, fuck those other guys. Mm-hmm. When the truth is, you probably don't want this war to go on forever on both sides. You probably don't want this war to go on forever. And the only way out is through. It's not about conquering one people entirely. That's not going to happen. So what is the way through? The way through is creating justice and equity for everyone who lives in the region, right? I don't necessarily have the answers when it comes to how you go about doing that. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what the borders of that look like, but I know it begins with humanizing everyone involved. Mm-hmm. And we could do that in practice by the way we talk to each other here. I have a feeling that I'm going to get hate on by everybody for the way I'm discussing this. God, you know what I mean? Like people on the right and the left are going to hate me for this because they're like, "Oh, how can you possibly be so milquetoast?" Like, no, but that really is the only way, right?
Well,
I have friends. I mean, I'm going to put myself on blast right now. I have friends who are in Hamas, right? Mm-hmm. I have friends there, and I am not afraid to say that what happened on October 7th was an abomination. Mm-hmm. I'm not afraid of what my friends are going to say to me. They probably would agree with me. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
But other activists online might try to snipe me 12 ways to Sunday.
Yeah.
Because they don't know this connection. They don't know that I've worked tirelessly to try and free the Alashi family from federal prison here in the United States, who ran the Holy Land Foundation. That is the thing that is the Achilles heel for Zoran Mandami's campaign right now. Those are good people. Those are good people that have been trying to do philanthropic aid in Gaza and in the West Bank for decades. And then after 9/11, they were maligned as terrorists.
Yeah.
I was in the CMU with some of those people. Those are some of the same people that made sure that I had shoes and were fed and were clothed and had everything that I needed while there. They were the same people that when there was a Israeli spy held in the SHU portion of the CMU who didn't want to come out to the regular portion of the CMU for fear of being amidst all these Muslims, they were gathering bread and shower shoes and other things and asking the guards, would you bring this bread and other stuff down to that gentleman, even if he doesn't want to be with us? Mm-hmm. Like, I think inherently in people's hearts is a desire to try to be good. And we should appeal to that. And I don't think that makes me Pollyanna-ish, right? Yeah. I've been in it. I've fought Nazis. I've fought, people overseas. My friend's been shot by the IDF. I know people in Hamas. I don't think I'm a sellout by saying we should try to find the humanity in each other. We should stop trying to others, and we should try to collapse that space that leads to this lack of empathy. Because ultimately, that's the same mechanics that we're working with when it comes to trying to liberate animals and get people to feel compassion for animals, is we want them to dig deep into that well of empathy that they were born with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you get hate for that, just so people know, I prompted you to talk about it in a way that was talking about animal activists otherizing each other. And you probably will. And that's what I'm getting at. That's the problem. And I will get hate for from both sides. For one, and I've received this already, so I know that's why I will. And maybe I won't. I mean, maybe it'll be muted. That's why I kind of feel like your ability to talk things through, I feel like is a great person to talk about this with. I've largely avoided talking about this because I see how divisive it is in our movement. And so I've both received criticism for not pushing it. So for instance, all the stuff that you just talked about from a seemingly, and I don't know, a seemingly informed perspective, I don't know all the facts. I know some people are going to say, why didn't you push back on Andy about this or that from like the pro-Israel side? And then from the pro-Palestine side, they'll be like, well, why aren't you saying I agree with Andy on this or that? Because I've gotten pushback for you're allowing someone to speak about this. I've gotten pushback. I just had Gary Yourofsky on my program a couple of weeks ago. I had people saying, shame on you for having him on. Shame on you for not calling him out about his views when we never even touched on it, never even discussed it. And that's sort of where I'm going with that question.
Well, I welcome you trying to dissect this and push back. I'm okay with it, talking about this with you. I'm not thrilled at the prospect of people cherry picking the things I say.
Yeah.
Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to speak in a more holistic way about the whole thing. Yeah. Because I want to see an end to the conflict entirely.
Right.
I don't want to be so bold to say I know the answer. Like, if you were to ask specific liberal groups, they're still holding on to this idea of a two-state solution as if it's viable. The West Bank has been so pockmarked with settlements that it's going to require something like a second Nakba to move people out of the way in order to give the West Bank back to the Palestinians. I don't want to create additional flashpoints, right? I am knowledgeable about the issue because I've been writing about the issue for some time now. But as much as I know, I'm left with more questions. Like I don't think any of us know what's best for others. All I can say is apartheid needs to stop. People need to humanize each other. People need to see just how little distance there is between them and their neighbor, especially in that particular case, which is one of the reasons why I brought it up, is that it is, if we can't tackle two people with essentially the same DNA fighting each other over the footnotes of a book, right? How are we going to convince our neighbor that a mouse in a laboratory has inherent worth? The distance there is so far. It's so far removed. And when you asked a question earlier on about like, well, why aren't people able to be empathetic? I think it's because the distance is too far. If we can't collapse that distance with things that are so close, if we can't tell narratives of how 200 years ago there were Bedouin and Arab au pairs that were breastfeeding Jewish children in Jerusalem, and that they were a tight-knit community where people loved each other. This is pre-Balfour, right? Where people loved each other and they did not judge each other based on their upbringings. If you look at fundamentalist Islam, like in the Ummah, it says like these are people of the book, and so they're protected no matter what. You don't really see that happening right now, but there was this doctrine that everyone would care for each other. In many ways, it was colonialism and European imposition that led to the friction that brought us here. And then also generational trauma, right? Like people who fled the Holocaust carried that trauma to their children. There was always the specter of it can happen again. And I think that may have turned into a default to dehumanize everybody who wasn't part of their group. And then they're kind of paying that same suffering forward. That's an oversimplification. I don't want to be a reductionist in here. That's an oversimplification. There's a lot of different things that are fueling this conflict. But at its core, people need to share a meal with each other. People need to
Yeah.
talk to one another. People need to build upon their disagreements in order to mend any path forward. And if we can't do that in our own movement, then we can't expect it of others.
Yeah. And that's what I can speak to, is just like, I just see people get so divided. And I mean, I'll bring it back to what you said about otherizing people. We're doing that to our fellow activists. I remember going through this thing. There was a separate infighting issue that I dealt with locally when we were organizing a campaign. Our group got destroyed by infighting. Luckily, we were still successful. Like, we had gotten the vast majority of our work done during our campaign. We still succeeded, thankfully. But I mean, I remember, like, I thought this was a beautiful quote. I don't know if it came to me. I don't know if I heard someone say it or if I came up with it, but I was like, we spend some time, we go to slaughterhouses to film. We can look in the eyes of a cow or a chicken and see someone there. And oftentimes we can't do that for our fellow activists, the people who are in this together because we have a common cause, that we're fighting for the animals. And this is where I've struggled, because, like, I've always just kept it primarily focused on the animals. So when outside politics comes in, I just try to steer clear of that. And some people don't like that. And that's just the way that I'm going to be. But I just, yeah, we're in one of those moments, as we always seem to be in our movement. You've been in the movement so much longer than me, but you alluded to, your friends in New York going through this. And I think, New York obviously is always a hotbed of, division and stuff. So yeah, I thought, yeah, it might be nice to talk to you about it. And I appreciate your perspective on it. And I hope that people will take that.
I don't know if I'm going to try to say this in a way that is safe for broadcast, but back in March of 2024, I was asked to speak to a large audience of pro-Palestine activists in Brooklyn. It included all the Columbia students that were getting ready to organize their campus occupation. And they wanted to discuss things like the Columbia Endowment. They wanted to discuss military targets like Elbit systems. And they wanted to learn about the SHAC campaign and how the SHAC campaign was able to target the financial pillars of support,
Right.
and how those tactics can carry over to their movement. And I remember the person who asked me to attend is also vegan, right? And they were a little bit worried about my desire to encourage everyone to humanize each other. They were worried about that. They said, we're worried that, like, some of these folks might try to cancel you for being like both sidesing the issue.
Oh.
And so I went through my whole presentation, which was a slide deck on, like, how you go after the financial pillars of support for a company like Elbit Systems, and how to think about strategic financial targets as it relates to Columbia University. And there was over 800 people there, probably 30 NYPD officers outside in the streets, like, waiting for the activists to get out, like, thinking there might be a protest after or something. I did not expect that many people to come hear me speak. I was a little bit nervous at the time. And I kind of veered into this idea that certain confrontational actions that the pro-Palestine activists were doing were not helpful for the overall cause. And one of them in particular was, they went to an art show of an artist that depicted scenes, or they may have been dramatized scenes from October 7th, right? It was an art show in New York. And they kind of shouted down the people who were bidding on the artwork, and they screamed at people and things like that, kind of like a walkthrough style protest. And I said, you have to give people space to grieve. There's nothing strategic in pulling down these posters that people are putting up about the missing Israelis or the hostages. I said, that just comes across as spiteful, right? People have a right to grieve. People did experience suffering. It doesn't negate your advocacy for the people who have had experienced 70 years of suffering under occupation, right? If you give someone some space to grieve. Just redivert your activism someplace else. Ignore that cultural flashpoint, right? Because you're going to come across as the bad guy. I said, everything that you do when it comes to going after Elbit systems or going after the Columbia Endowment, pair it with humanize, humanize, humanize. And it was interesting because the person who invited me there was like, oh shit, Andy's going to get canceled for saying this. And you know, the reason why I didn't was because I was in the CMU with the Alashi family and I was fighting for the Alashi family to be set free. They said, oh, well, you know, he must be down or he must understand. And I thought that was so strange that the reason why they decided not to complain or stand up to me was because I was in prison and I somehow had more credibility because I was in prison. Me being in prison doesn't give me more credibility. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't make me more knowledgeable. But for some reason, like in this cultural zeitgeist, that made me able to say the things that other people weren't allowed to say, which I think is strange. And it's something that we should consider in the way that we talk and deal with each other. Is sometimes there's laudable ideas that make everyone uncomfortable and we kind of have to suss through them. It's not about team sports where this person who came up with this laudable idea is somehow wrong. It's how do we integrate this laudable idea with the activism that we're doing right now? And so I said, by all means, go after the financial pillars of support of the people that are making the bombs that are falling on Gaza. But if somebody's here with an art show depicting some grief, man, that is not a good use of your time to go and yell at them.
Yeah.
You know? And their argument was, oh, they're manufacturing consent for genocide. Maybe. But going after the bombs is so much more strategic. Just do it. You know? Just like there may be someone in our movement that has problematic views, but wants to build coalition in going after a factory farm. Do we kick them out of that coalition? I don't necessarily think that's the right idea. Should we try to achieve some sort of dialogue with them? Yes. If dialogue doesn't work and they only want to do animal advocacy, then bite your lip and do your animal advocacy alongside of them because the animals need us and we are a minority movement. We do not have a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And by the way, I shouldn't say we like that. I'm not a leader in the animal rights movement anymore. I'm someone mostly from the past who just does a little bit of animal rights activism now. So I don't want to make it seem like I have any say or control over the movement right now because I don't. But these are just my opinions.
Yeah. They're your opinions, and I feel like anybody should take that that same approach, that they don't have any say over the animal rights movement because it's a big thing, you know. So I'll just say, you know, both you and I, even through our questions, it's just our opinion of like how we want to frame things, how we want to talk about things. I'm not an expert. You're not an expert. I do think that you do have a lot of credibility to speak on these topics, which is why I'm asking you about them. By the way, are you able to go long? Because we're almost at 2 hours and we haven't even gotten to a lot of the CMU. I guess we did talk about the CMU quite a bit, but how
What are you, Joe Rogan? Like, what kind of operation are you running over here? Do people pay attention all the way to the end?
I think some people have paid attention, but this one, maybe if you're willing to go long, I might cut it into two parts or so.
I'm totally fine with it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, let's just rip the Band-Aid off and get it all done. If I'm gonna get canceled, I better as well canceled all the way as opposed to halfway.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so interesting. I just feel like we are in this time of cancel culture, and just the fact that you could explain that in such a measured way and have to worry about being canceled, to me, is insane. And I feel like I've been very measured about how I've approached these topics too. And I should say, you know, like other people get, you know, more criticism than I do, because I mostly have steered clear. And by the way, the people who have criticized me, and I actually, you know, when it came to Gary Yarovsky, I had a friend who reached out to me, was pretty upset, and they reached out to me in a very, very respectful way. And I feel like, you know, people have that right to have that opinion and to express that opinion to me, even the angry ones, you know, which I've gotten some. But yeah, I do think that's ridiculous though, that you and you're going to downplay your credibility, but you, with all your credibility, I feel like you do have a lot of credibility, would have to worry about that. Just to speak on it and speak about it honestly, I think is just such a shame. And the fact is, you're right. We are in that kind of like culture where people are like, rushing to vilify someone. And that's what I'm getting at. And we're doing that in our animal rights movement to each other. And all that benefits is the animal exploitation industry. That's my opinion. I don't see.
I wonder if there's like a little bit more of a psychological reason for why people do it, in that people feel at a loss, right? People feel disempowered where they sit. People feel like they can't change animal industry. People feel like they can't change geopolitics. People feel like they can't change our socioeconomic systems. And yet here's someone who's right in front of you who's saying something that you partially disagree with, and you could bark them down. And so I think sometimes people who have this fire inside them, the fire is coming from the same well of empathy that we had talked about earlier. And they have nowhere to direct that fire. And so it ends up being directed on each other.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people in the animal rights movement are hurt people, myself included.
Right.
This is how we ended up developing this empathy for animals. And we should think about our hurt, and we should think about ways that we can creatively utilize our hurt to benefit the world and benefit each other, but not let that hurt or dysfunction spill over in the way that we deal with each other. I'm not going to be declarative about one side or the other in these disputes. There are public figures who I am not thrilled about what they're saying right now. I don't necessarily group myself in the same grouping as like a public figure like that. As you alluded to earlier, myself and my co-defendants are less public. I feel like we always have been. But with the exception of maybe Jake. Jake likes making videos, he likes airing out. Sure. But aside from that, most of us have not been that public. And I've been working to protect one activist in New York who I care about a lot, who seems to be dragged into this, that I feel like they didn't really participate in any way, that they don't deserve the treatment that they're getting. But I'm offering basic, public affairs and PR advice and helping them navigate this right now. And more often than not, the professional advice is don't respond. It's just, you don't have to respond to everything. You don't owe the public this take. There's a lot of takes out there. And I think that everything should come from a place of empathy and humanizing. And if you start from a place of empathy and humanizing, I would argue that that means that you will end up at a place that empathizes and humanizes Palestinians that are suffering right now. That does not mean that you have to vilify other groups of people that may be misguided and have not come to where you're at yet. Because just like when we think about animal issues, so many of us started our lives eating meat, right? We came to these issues, we stumbled upon them, some of them for the right reasons, wrong reasons, whatever, but we stayed. And that means that at one point we made a change in our lives, right? These people are not incapable of changing, and they're less likely to change if you're ostracizing them.
Yeah. Well, that was well said. I hope that people will, at least from this, take from that we could treat each other with that empathy, that same empathy that we want that we want for the animals, that we want for whichever oppressed people that we're talking about at that time. You said something earlier, and this can kind of transition us back to the animals, because I do want to kind of get back to that. I won't name this person, but I know someone who is a known member of the ALF who was talking with Wayne Shung, and they were having this discussion. This was public discussion, by the way, about how for that person who was freeing animals at that time with the ALF, they were doing so out of a sense of desperation, like a sense of um, the word was like pessimism, basically. Whereas like Wayne had this like optimism, and I wonder what your take on that was when you were like going in, you know, you had like we talked about the rage where you were going after the fur shop, smashing the windows, that sort of thing. Were you feeling pessimistic at that time, or were you feeling like, no, it's like I can actually do something, I can change this? Or it was, I don't know what I'm at. Is it like a little bit of both? Like, let me save this group of animals because I don't know how I can save all the animals.
I don't think it's one or the other. I think if I was to look at it, and this is semi-chronological because I don't remember which happened when, right?
Yeah.
So in this semi-chronological order, I would say that 19-year-old me smashing the first shop windows, there definitely was an element of anger and rage going into it. And then a year or so passes of small victories, and I start becoming more strategic, right? I start refining my tactics. Outside of HLS, I freed some 400 something other animals from places of abuse, factory farm settings, breeders for vivisection, those kinds of things, without naming all the physical locations, right?
Yeah.
I remember working with a small group of people with a variety of backgrounds, variety of races, variety of genders. And I think one thing that's underrepresented is some of the most amazing actions that I went on were largely led by women. I feel like a lot of the times, the way these stories are told or based on the people who were arrested, there is a sense that there's a masculine element to it. And I found that some of the most important memories that I have for actions were women that were at the helm, queer folks that were at the helm. In one particular action, there was a woman of color who was at the helm of one of our actions. And I feel like that's underrepresented in our larger movement. And I think it does a disservice to paint me as the one who did all of it, right? I'm just the one who got caught, and now I'm talking about some of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other people went on just to live lives that no one ever knew who they were, right?
Yeah.
They avoided all the touch points that I did by wearing multiple hats. But I remember we would get together, and even though I hadn't really formulated my religious views yet, which, by the way, I don't even know if they're fully formulated, but I used to pray, and we used to pray before an action, and we would have a portion of our prayer or like meditative type circle for people who believed in God, and another portion that was for people who were atheist, and we held space for both of them. So we had some augmentation of the thing that we would ask to be watched over, that we could free as many creatures as possible and not have any contact with law enforcement or not get into any physical conflicts or whatever else like that, to get in and out quickly. And we prayed for success. And then for people that didn't feel comfortable praying, we just had this thing, we all kind of held hands in a circle and like, we're all going to take care of each other. And we're going to carry that feeling of taking care of each other. We're not going to let anyone fall behind, or if someone falls behind, like, we're going to always be there to protect each other. And then we had a moment where we visualized being in prison for a set amount of time associated with the crimes that we did. And we gave everyone an opportunity to turn around and walk away. And I found that those were some of the most moving kinds of activism that I did, because there was no judgment if somebody walked away in those moments. It was always like, this is what we're facing. These are the types of actions that we're doing tonight. The worst possible case scenario is 3 to 7 years in prison. Do you still feel comfortable proceeding forward? And then we would tell like some sort of story of like what it would be like sitting in the concrete box for months, right? And then be like, are you still okay? Okay, all right. Now we're gonna do this prayer, and then we're gonna take care of each other, and everyone, whatever, set your radios to such and such. And then we'd ask people the questions like, if we have to switch channels, do you know what channel to switch to? Like those kinds of things, like kind of go through those things before we would deploy the action later on that night. And why am I bringing this up? Oh, optimism. I felt a lot of personally, I felt a lot of divine presence in a lot of this. I felt that some of the best moments of my life were when I was freeing animals from abuse. I think it's because it's the rawest, most baseline manifestation of empathy that someone could do. And I don't think it's limited to just doing ALF type stuff. This is why, like, I quickly wanted to do as much as I could to support Zoe Rosenberg, because I see it in her as well, this selflessness of wanting to make sure that she could save these lives almost to the detriment of her own, right? I love her for that. I think she's my hero, right? Like, she's always going to see this and probably get red faced that, like, you know, this old head is like, she's my hero now.
But I hope she sees it. She's a little busy. Yeah.
And she's got things going on right now, actually, as we speak. But no, she's a hero of mine. And now that I'm at 47 years old and a little bit burnt out, I look at this younger generation for inspiration to kind of just keep going.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a husk of the thing I was before. Right. I still have it in me. Right. But I'm not nearly as strong as I was when I was in my 20s. And I owe a portion of my strength to what Zoe and the DXE folks and others are doing right now. They're inspiring me. You know, I'm not a huge fan of PETA writ large. No disrespect for the people from PETA that might be hearing this, but my God, do I love those people in New York that have just, for the first time in decades, actualized a ban on horse carriages in Central Park. Like, they won, finally. Like, they're my heroes. You know, Ashley Byrne, if you see this, you're a hero of mine. You know, Zoe Rosenberg, if you see this, you're a hero of mine. Like, for those young people that freed the mink in Pennsylvania, like, you guys are my heroes. And it's not linear. There's no hierarchy to this. Like, I look back at them now, and that's where I derive my optimism from. In those moments, I felt optimism when we were in those circles and we were praying and we were making real on the stuff that we promised and set out to do. You know, that night we were in an attic in, I want to say it was maybe Trenton, New Jersey. And we said our prayers and we headed out along some riverside that was near HLS. And we came back with 14 dogs that night. Were we sad that we couldn't get 28? Yeah, we were sad. And the reason why was ultimately a decision from somebody else. They didn't want to pop the doors for the second unit and only leave with 2 or 3 dogs and have the other ones not see, you know, like to not see what freedom would be like, but see their other friends get rescued. And so we did each unit at a time, and one unit was 14. And we received something on our radio that made it indicate that a security guard was coming back around. They may have seen us in the building. In retrospect, they did not see us in the building. They just happened to stop near a vent that we entered from, and then they kept moving. But that stopping was what led to a radio call coming in that led to us not getting the other 14. We could have left with 28 dogs that night, you know? That I regret. I don't regret anything else, you know, like, but we also
shared this, by the way?
I
had not heard that. Had you shared that you had rescued those beagles before?
I've definitely told people before. I think I said during a public speech in California that I was involved with the beagles, but I don't know if I've done it on a podcast. So maybe you have an exclusive. I don't know.
Hey, nice. The exclusive.
Yeah. Air horn. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just a couple things from that. You had mentioned sort of like the male dominated like image, and like you mentioned, that would be a fallacy, because you just brought up Zoe. Zoe's on trial right now. You know, and also people of color as well. I mean, for one, when it comes to ALF actions, right? Ingrid Newkirk, she wrote the Free the Animals book about Valerie, the woman who brought the ALF over. So for anybody thinking it's just a male-dominated thing, it was a woman who brought the ALF allegedly over from the UK into America. And then when my buddy Wayne, who's a Chinese American, was on trial for, rescuing chickens, was on trial. His co-defendants at the time were Priya Sahani and Cassie King at that time, and through circumstances, the situation changed. But yeah, like you mentioned, just tons of women. I mean, like DXC is woman-led primarily. So
yeah, Almira is another hero of mine.
oh, I know, mine too.
Fantastic, yeah.
And this thing too, like calling people heroes and stuff, like
I don't say it in a way to disempower others. Like, you can't do that. Like, people should aspire to be the next Almira. People should aspire to be the next Zoe Rosenberg.
Me too.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say about that was, for however appropriate it is to say that, for those animals, for those dogs that you rescued, you are their hero, like literally. And the same for the chickens that Zoe rescued, and the chickens that Wayne rescued. And so, I mean, yeah, you are heroes, like by a literal sense of the word. So, if those animals could thank you, they would thank you, obviously, which I know that's not why you did it. But yeah, it's just a beautiful thing. I'm so grateful to you for that. And that's I mean, I already liked you, Andy, but I didn't even know that about you. I mean, I knew you had done ALF actions. I knew you had, gone to prison for the SHAC campaign. But yeah, that's a beautiful story. And thank you for doing that for those dogs. You gave them a life. Even doing 3 years in prison and, being in a CMU, I'm sure at least you could think back, those dogs are free because of me, or in some home. I don't know where they ended up,
I wrote about this, and I gave a public talk at one of those animal rights conventions a few years ago. I could try to surface it and send it to you, but essentially it was a thank you letter to the animals that I freed from abuse, because ultimately, outside of my partner at the time being there to kind of really be a life preserver for me, I could fall back on those memories of the beings that I freed.
And by the way, we were mentioning all these like great women in the movement. Lauren Gazzola, I should shout out too, like your co-defendant. I mean, I know you. Yeah.
One of the strongest ladies I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
she's often keeping me in line. And I can imagine that what I just told you right now, she's going to be annoyed. I told you.
Yeah.
She'd be like, why did you volunteer that information? I'd be like, I don't know. We were talking for 2.5 hours, Lauren. Yeah. Like, you're bound to. You know what's funny is I have clients in my job, right, where like Joe Rogan is called up and like asked them to be on, and I've said no, right?
Really?
And I always tell them no. I said, don't do Joe Rogan. It goes too long, and your chances of saying something you're going to trip up on are way too high. So I've dissuaded a lot of people from doing Joe Rogan because I'm just like, you talk for that long, you're bound to say something that's going to get you fucked up. And and now here I am doing exactly that with you, like.
Yeah.
Disobeying my own advice.
Well, but yeah, like I said, if need be, we can always cut things out if you think of them later. Speaking of, we've mentioned how a lot of your co-defendants are private people, fairly private people. You had mentioned Darius earlier, so don't talk about him if you can't talk about him. But it's interesting to me that when I was thinking of, and this is no shade on Darius, but when I was thinking, who are the SHAC 7? By the way, SHAC 7 includes SHAC itself. So there were 6 activists.
There was a 7th person in the beginning.
That's true. Yeah, John that's McGee. Right. But Darius, I was trying to think of everybody, and I was like, who's the person that I'm not thinking of? And I think it's like, I don't know why, but Darius wasn't as visible in the film, I guess. And I just don't know much about Darius. Why is that?
Because Darius didn't do anything wrong, right?
Nobody did.
Look, I don't know for certain what Chris Christie's prosecutorial theory was, because it appeared as if They were first investigating SHAC underneath something called the Hobbs Act, which is a racketeering, influence, corrupt organization type charge.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why it did not move forward underneath those statutes was because they said that the people, the activists involved, had no financial motive, right? That they're usually in a racketeering type group, there is a financial end, that it's like a business, and there is a financial component to the crime. There was no financial component here. But along the way, I think they were trying to establish some sort of hierarchy amongst the seven of us. And when they arrested John McGee, they were trying to say that John McGee received, they were hoping that John McGee would cooperate and say that John McGee received an address from Darius Fulmer, who in turn received that from Kevin Jonas. And that there was this like chain of custody, that John McGee found out where the vice president of the Bank of New York lived and then threw a brick through the back window of his Jaguar or whatever in his driveway, because he was given that address from SHAC activists, from Darius Fulmer specifically, and then Darius got that from Kevin. And they were unable to articulate that, because when they finally found out the truth, and they offered, to my knowledge, they offered John McGee a proffer, that in his proffer he said that he found the address on his own, that he had no connections to anyone higher up in SHAC, and that his tangential connections to Darius Fulmer just had to do with the animal rights movement and like music culture. It didn't have anything to do with anything. And so that part of the prosecutorial theory appeared to have fallen apart, which made John McGee less useful to the overall prosecution. And so they dropped him come the second trial. He was not included. And one would say, I guess, that Chris Christie and Ricardo Solano and I forgot the other guy's name, who was the prosecutor, the assistant U.S. attorney at the time, Charlie McKenna, that they saw a weakness in presenting that John McGee researched the target on his own, found the target on his own, and then took direct action on his own. Because what that does is that actually shows a decentralized nature to these actions and does not show the hierarchy that they were trying to paint. I think they were trying to do similar things with me, and they were unable to actually show that continuity. I remember at one point they said that Kevin and I switched from regular phone to talking over PGP, encrypted email, and they used that as a sign of criminal intent. But if you looked underneath the hood of those PGP messages, what we were discussing at the time was how to stay compliant with time, manner, and place restrictions on protests and not expose regular protesters to risk of arrest. So really all we were talking about was the element of surprise and how do we space out protests in order to be adherent and compliant with the court's orders. So all we were doing was legal activity underneath PGP, but because they couldn't see under the hood of those messages, they used that to create a supposition of criminality. So in Darius's case, the only thing they presented in court was that Darius talked to Kevin on the phone about the time and place of a specific protest, and that was it.
Wow.
And so I think when you don't see much of him in the movie, it's largely because the movie is based largely upon the court record. And he was not mentioned in the court record. Wow. He was mentioned in the context of being an organizer in New Jersey, just like I was mentioned in the context of being an organizer in Long Island. And things happened in New Jersey and Long Island because a lot of the financial targets were people who had homes in the suburbs of New York City, you know, and they don't live in the city proper. They live in New Jersey, or they live in Long Island or Westchester or wherever. And that's why, like, us as organizers became significant to the campaign, but no less significant than the organizers in the Bay Area or in Austin or wherever else there was robust activity at the time.
Yeah, it was just like location. Yeah. Oh, I should mention, yeah, there's a film called The Animal People. Highly recommend. It's about this case. And Chris, you mentioned Chris Christie. If people were wondering, yes, it's that Chris Christie, the presidential candidate at one point. I think multiple times he ran for president.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's the one who did end up prosecuting Andy here. So yeah, but where was I going with that? Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, I just hadn't thought of his name as much, I guess, and it
He's
didn't
still
ring.
doing activism. He's
Is he?
a lawyer right now. He's working to help other activists. He is still vegan. He's married to a vegan. She's
Hmm.
also a lawyer helping activists. He's still here. He's still participating. He's still adding value. So he didn't just disappear.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, you had sort of mentioned something. I just want to say this, like, encouragingly. You had mentioned like I'm not as strong as I once was. I don't view it that way. I hope you don't, take that to, like you're just at a different stage, I would say, of your activism, of your career, of your life. So I don't know. I just hope you take that positively. I, I don't view you as weaker for whatever role you occupy in the movement at this point. And also the things that you've done over the course of your life. Not that it's a contest; it's never a contest, obviously, but it's more than most people have done. So take that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but I also want to be honest with people that it has taken its toll on me.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. And you had mentioned that even before we, started recording, when we got in contact a couple weeks ago, you had mentioned that you were suffering from a lot of PTSD, and you've talked a lot about the therapy and stuff during the course of this, and opened up a lot about it. But yeah, and I've seen you in other interviews sort of say like, this can be something of a cautionary tale. Like, yes, this really impacted my life. Um, how are you these days? I mean, like, because I actually haven't seen interviews with you for quite a while. So, how's your life now? Like, what are you up to these days?
I actually can't talk about it.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Oh,
working on something really important. That's all I can say right now is outside of helping individual clients that are doing good work, I'm working on a big project I've been working on for about 9 months. And
okay. Okay.
and then separate from that, I've been working on a piece of writing that I've been working on for nearly 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that relates to collapsing that distance that we talked about earlier. Um, it is a story of how we as people have a tendency to be tribal and to default on othering others.
Mhm.
And it's a story that spans everything from the war in Gaza to the food on our plates, and how we create that distance. And I do feel a lot of pressure right now to produce more right now because it seems so relevant to the moment we're living in. Um, but I also know I can't get it done with the other work I'm doing right now.
Mhm.
And maybe one day it will be done. And maybe I'll even reach out to you and say, hey, I'm ready to do an interview about it if you're willing
Yeah.
to have me back on a second time.
Yeah.
But I've been
If
very
you're not,
intentional.
we'll see if you get canceled in the meantime. I don't know. I don't know.
I've been very intentional about not doing as much media
Hmm.
while doing other work. In part because when it comes to client-facing work, I want to make sure that I don't ever shine into the story. The story's about them, and the other reason is to not really put attention on myself during times when I'm working on something important.
Mm.
Just finish the project first. Yeah.
Well, it means a whole lot to me that you came on for that reason. Like, I mean, for a lot of reasons, but I mean, for not seeing you in many interviews, the fact that you answered the call, I really, it means a lot to me. I've seen you talk about this writing that you were doing in prison, and that never ended up being a book. Is some of this like that writing? Are you working
It's
on
not
putting out a book?
actually.
Oh,
It
okay.
it I don't think any of that is going to appear in the final product that I'm working on now. Um, it is weird to look back on it. Like I wrote about 380 pages towards a book while I was in prison. Um, the working title at the time was called The Blueprint, and but the book kind of it was strange. Before I got jettisoned away from FCI Butner and went to the CMU, I had gotten caught at least once writing the book, I wasn't allowed to use the computers for that purpose.
Oh, yeah.
I found a way to save when you weren't supposed to save permanent files, and was saving it to, it was nothing online. I was saving it to a central server on the prison complex, hidden in a temp file, and then would access it and then write some more and then put it back and then write some more. And then I'd print it up in the law library and send it out to a lawyer I was friends with to have for safekeeping. And the last bit of writing, it is what I was writing in prison are two separate timelines, right? One begins with my incarceration starting and moves forward. So every other chapter is the incarceration, right? Every other chapter intersposed amidst that is a chapter from childhood, things that inform my activism. Mm-hmm. That timeline, the childhood timeline, based on the outline I was writing, ends with me going to prison, right? So the book essentially ends with me both becoming free and going to prison at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like these two timelines come full circle and they meet each other again. And I took an approach to it of being a work of experimental fiction because I thought that would give me more flexibility to write about things that I couldn't say specifically, like breaking into laboratories and freeing animals by changing time, place, things like that ever so slightly to protect the innocent. Mm-hmm. But then I hit the part where the cop was talking to me about my father. And I found myself that day just feverishly typing. And I went back and I reread the stuff that I was typing as if I was having like an out-of-body experience. Like, how did I not think about this more? And how is it all spilling out of me so freely in this setting? And I kind of paused writing at that point. And that was a couple of weeks before they transferred me to the CMU. And that became a big like disruption in the whole thing. It's like, I didn't know exactly where that was coming from. I had this very strange feeling, like I had a realization about my life. It made me think that if that had not happened to me, would I just be another one of these guys wearing the white hats playing lacrosse in high school and never got into any of the movements that I cared about, just out drinking beers with the guys, like in a fraternity or something, which is how a lot of kids in my neighborhood ended up. They ended up working on Wall Street or something, right? It just gave me a very strange existential feeling. Like, could I have not even been here had I not experienced this? And then also this sense of uncertainty, because it happened when I was so young. My memories of it were spotty, that I started feeling guilty. Like, should I even write about this? What if this guy only did one thing and not these three things? What if I get it wrong? Even though I'm changing his name, like, would he know it's him? You see what I'm saying? Like, this is what was going on in my mind. And it kind of led to this stalemate where I stopped writing at that point. I got out. Someone had transcribed everything that I had sent to the lawyer and put it into a working document outside. And I never really moved forward. The reason why I didn't move forward is because I was approached by a literary agent that said they can get me a book deal. I was offered a book deal, and the moment I had a meeting with the publisher, it was like they wanted the tea on the SHAC 7, like who was sleeping with who and who was doing this and what was the movement like and all these other things. And I'm like, I'm not telling this story. I wanted to do this other thing over here. And they're like, oh, well, that's just like some artsy fartsy thing. Why are you trying to do that? And I realized they weren't interested in publishing the book that I wanted to publish. Yeah. They were interested in like something that was the type of product they wanted to create, you know? Yeah. And so that combined with work and now starting a family and everything else like that led to me pausing. As I started to get more established in my life, I started going out on the road and filming with families of people who were left behind in the CMU. Because at that point, I had been the only person released from the CMU and everyone else was still incarcerated. And there was very little known about the CMUs. And those men have no access to the outside world. They can't tell their stories. So I was trying to tell their stories through their families. And what I was finding time and time again was these cases in which people were overcharged. I'm not going to be so naive to say they didn't do anything wrong, but they were grossly overcharged in the wake of 9/11. And I started seeing patterns develop where after 9/11, the reflex, both politically and socially, was to find a scapegoat. And then funding rushed into these zones where they're like, okay, get some terrorism collars, you can earn some money. And that intersected both my life with the SHAC 7 and Chris Christie feeling a need to produce a terrorism indictment. But even more so than the SHAC 7, the story of the Duca brothers, these roofers that were Muslim, that lived in New Jersey, that were surrounded by federal informants that were trying to take them on trips to the Poconos, to shooting ranges, things like that, filming them with hidden cameras, getting them to say things like Allahu Akbar as they're shooting the guns when they may not have been inclined to say so, and coaxing them into conversations about what is permissible and not permissible or haram underneath Shahad. And those recordings led to them serving life in prison when none of them took any viable action. None of them advanced any action to hurt any US soldiers or others. The only person who did advance what they thought was an attack on the Fort Dix military base was a friend of theirs, 3 friends removed, and a federal agent that drove to the premises to scout it out. And then they talked about it afterwards in the Poconos with them. And it was just this case where there was no case there. These men didn't do anything wrong. And they were on video essentially talking this guy out of violent activism, saying violent activism isn't in line with our faith. They were like, Aki, that's haram. You can't do that in Islam. Like, you don't know if those people have children. You don't know what they were involved with. And the federal agents would be arguing, saying, oh, these people are soldiers. They're the kafir. They're the infidels. And they weren't agreeing. And those men are serving life. And I found myself filming with their family, spending time with their family, meeting other families that have gone through similar things, and realizing it doesn't just end with this idea of othering animals, that we've created a whole outcast class of people based on their faith in the wake of 9/11. And those are those Muslim folks. But now that's morphed again. It morphed from Muslim folks to migrants, and creating scapegoats around migrants and the economy. It morphed from migrants. Now, what we're looking at right now is the development of a trans narrative, that they're dehumanizing trans people, saying they have a proclivity for violence, right, in the wakes of these shootings, even though those stories hardly match up, right? Like, and the shooter themselves wasn't trans. They're calling them trans adjacent, but they're in talks right now about creating a new terrorist class called trans identity violent extremism, like, or trans inspired violent extremism, as if like just being trans is somehow congruent with violence. And it's not only not rooted in fact, but it's a concocted narrative that serves a political purpose that kind of hones in on these very banal and basic ideas of othering. It's as if Trump excels at one thing, it's finding that loose thread and pulling it. It's finding a way to refract and refine people's anger and then point people's anger towards where he wants it pointed towards, as opposed to a place like advocating for the rights of us all, right? Yeah. It's let's point at this very niche thing over here and let's look at this shiny object because that's the source of all your problems, when truth is much more complicated than that, right? And I realized that this concept of othering extends so far to so many assets of our socio-political lives that it would be myopic for me to write just about what I experienced and what animals experience, but rather to tell a personal narrative of what I experienced, the dehumanization that I experienced as a child that led me to identify with the dehumanization of animals, that led me to prison, to meet people who have been dehumanized, and to see this cycle perpetuate, and then think about ways of interrupting this cycle. And so that thing that I'm working on is a series of writing and multimedia stuff, and that's called Gethsemane. It's not seen the light of day yet. And I probably shouldn't be sharing as much as I'm sharing right now with you, because anybody who's going to publish it one day is going to be like, why'd you tell all the secrets before it's out, you know?
Well, I mean, if you want, we can take it out too, you know, just let me know.
I don't think we need to take it out, but I just want to make sure I don't share too much more. That's all.
Yeah.
Like, I got to save it for later.
Well, I guess my question is, does that mean that what you were writing in prison, that book, is going to see the light of day in just a different form, like as part of this like broader story?
No, if anything, it was probably just training getting
Oh,
me
interesting.
ready to write the rest.
You know where
I
I'm
feel
going
like,
with this, right? It's to encourage you to release that book because I'm curious what you wrote.
oh, I
It'd be
mean,
awesome to.
maybe I could just throw the PDF online somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. You should self-publish it, because a lot of people self-publish these days. But anyway, I don't want to pressure you into doing something you don't want to do, but I'm always really interested
I
in
mean, I'm a
books
comms
about.
person, so I'm a very much like a less is more person. I
Oh,
I
I'm
I,
the
I believe in
yeah,
quality over quantity, so I'm not just going to drop a PDF unless it's perfect. Like,
yeah.
so
I
I
understand.
think
I
the prison
understand.
writing might never see the light of day. I'm sorry to say that, but like the other one will be inspired by the prison writing and will carry
Mhm.
forward and hopefully finish.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. I can't recall reading much about the Shack Seven. I read Tom Harris's book. I had him on to talk about that book, and so he wrote about it, from the UK perspective and that sort of thing. But I can't recall. Am I missing that? Is there a book written from about like the Shack USA
Um,
campaign?
Dara Lovitz wrote a book called "Muzzling a Movement"
Oh, okay,
that
interesting. I'll check it
largely
out.
touches on the Shack Seven.
Gotcha.
There's another book called Green is the New Red
Yeah.
that covers both Daniel McGowan and Shack Seven. Um, I don't know of many others.
Yeah, Will Potter's book. Yeah. He just put out a new book, by the way. I was even gonna touch on that because we're so long, but I was gonna touch on Alec because I started to hear more about Alec these days and reading Will's book. He talks about Alec, and then I've seen you talk about Alec in your talks and all that. But maybe we should just talk. I don't know if you're okay with sharing a little bit about Daniel McGowan, but I just watched that movie. What was it called? I forget what it
If
was
a Tree
called.
Falls.
Yeah, yeah. So I, sort of got to see Daniel in the film, and I wonder, like, I'm curious about y'all's friendship that I assume that you guys had, and what like what that was like, and and I almost wanted to bring it all the way back to the beginning because you mentioned that it was like sort of excuse me, the environmental movement that you got started with, and then here you were in a CMU with someone portrayed as a terrorist in the Earth Liberation Front. Yeah.
I, I mean, I don't know if this has ever been reported on, but remember I said earlier in this interview that I worked at the Wetlands Activism Center as like my first internship when I was 18.
Mhm.
I worked there with Daniel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we shared a desk.
Oh, you shared a desk? Oh,
Yeah.
man.
So
Wow.
like all this thing kind of comes like, like,
Full circle.
yeah.
That's wild because
Yeah, he
I
moved
mean
to the West Coast after being in New York for a while. I think he and I actually chained ourselves to Macy's in like 1999
yeah.
together. He was in our friends group in New York. He's originally from Rockaway Beach, Queens, New York. He was more in the environmental circles. He was active with groups in the wetlands. I wanted to say that he did a lot of the forest defense work and the Moore Gardens organizing that was coming out of the Wetlands Activism Center at the time.
Mhm.
So he wasn't exactly on the same page as like Justin and all them for like the Thursday night animal rights meetings, but he was active in that. It's so much work came out of that basement of that community center. Um, so he and I knew each other during those years. He was a few years older than me, so he was in his 20s and I was 18 at the time. Then I went to jail for the ALF stuff, 90 days or whatever, and then 11 months, and I would get letters from someone named Rabbit from the Pacific Northwest. I never put together that the person Rabbit who was writing me was Daniel. And
Oh,
so when I
wow.
got out, he's like, "How did you not know it was me?" And I was like, "I don't know. I just thought it was so." I imagined some old, like, like Tolkien-esque, like
Yeah,
guy living
yeah.
in the woods named Rabbit. I don't know. That's how I imagined it, and therefore I never imagined Daniel's face on that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I was like, "Oh, I didn't know that was you." And he's like, "I gave you all these hints." I still went right over my head, right? I didn't know he was writing me letters under a fake name. And then when he was arrested for the ELF stuff, I remember being in court that morning with his lawyer trying to figure out how to help him. And then I remember seeing the list of charges levied against him And I just went out in the hallway and I cried because they said he's facing life plus 365 years. And I just thought he would never come home. Like, I just thought, like, that's it for him, you know? And then he gets out, is temporarily on house arrest. I have no interaction with him because at this point I get arrested for the SHAC thing. Those timelines kind of overlap, right? He's out for a little bit. I'm out for a little bit. And we don't talk because we both have probation officers, right? Like, we can't have any contact. And then I go into the federal system about a year before him, serving my federal sentence for SHAC. And then I remember listening to NPR one morning, and it was him being sentenced with the terrorism enhancement. But also the lawyers managed, it was very, very brilliant kind of legal craft on their part. They had a Hail Mary pass of sorts where they wanted to know about a surveillance program that the NSA and or DOJ had access to. And this was based on a hunch that, and I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm going to just talk about it in like more of an overbroad way because I might get a detail wrong, and I don't want to get a detail wrong here. It was based on a hunch that I believe Jonathan Paul had, that they couldn't have known where he was physically located without checking a phone or something, and that they somehow knew where his cell phone was located based on where he was at, despite not being under federal surveillance. Right? Because I think he was on a firefighter boat or something at the time. He was a firefighter. And so they're like, I think the government has some sort of way of seeing where all our phones are, or like knows all of our metadata, right? And this is pre-Snowden, pre all the other stuff, right? And I remember my brother coming to visit me in Butner in North Carolina because my brother was either volunteering or had some work that overlapped with the National Lawyers Guild, and said that Gideon Oliver and others want to file this motion to like unmask a program that's surveilling activists. And I don't know exactly how they did it, but I remember people on Daniel's legal team articulated, we want to see this as part of our pretrial discovery. We want to see this surveillance stuff. And the government didn't want to acknowledge the existence of a program like that. And so this was a sort of Hail Mary pass. Like they knew they were putting the government in a position where they don't want to acknowledge the existence of such a program, even if it didn't overlap Daniel or Jonathan Paul or others, right? And I still don't know if it ever did, right? It may have, I don't know, right? But just them asking put them in this awkward position of having to articulate whether or not a program like this exists, which is what they didn't want to do. And in turn, I think it created a favorable environment to him getting a better plea bargain because they wanted to just get it over with. And so they offer him this global plea of, I think it was 8.5 years for everything that he did, as long as he debriefs to everything that he did without naming others. And so he got a very good plea compared to the life plus 365 years. Mm-hmm. But boy, it was, he carried a heavy weight for many years. And then he arrived at the CMU. And I remember I arrived at the CMU a month or so before him. And there was a individual who had a title called Intelligence Research Specialist, or IRS. They were like the prison's equivalent to the CIA. And their job was to understand like the psychographic profiles of all the people inside the CMU. Like they knew everything about them, right? And they kind of tried to interrogate me on my way into the CMU. And it was illustrative because he has this big binder of all these like animal rights actions and everything, as well as actions dedicated to like saying like free Andy and stuff on the side. I wish I could FOIA that binder. It was a badass looking binder. I don't even know what to look for, but like it had all these like crazy actions that I've never heard about before, like kind of photocopied crime scene type stuff in the binder. And he said, oh, one of your people's coming here. And I was like, one of my people? I was like, oh yeah, like one of you guys, one of you activists is going to be here. And I was like, I wonder which one it is. And then, like the morning he arrived, I just remember hearing, hey, yo, Stepanian, you in here? And I'm just like, no fucking way. To go from like being at that desk with him when I was 18 to like him walking in and like that was like, and all the Muslims looking at us like, oh, there's another one of them now. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's pretty funny. It was
So did
definitely,
y'all like y'all I mean that must have been surreal and also just
but it was also like being in a little place with your brother who you have a tendency to bicker with. We
oh
would get
yeah.
into crazy arguments. And by the way,
Really?
like nothing but love to him right now. I saw him about last weekend. I saw him.
Oh nice.
He owns a bookstore out here now in Long Island, which if people get a chance to visit Tiny Raccoon Books and patronize it, you should. That's my shout out for this episode.
Nice.
Yeah, he's doing great, and it was great seeing him. And we did bicker a lot while in the CMU. But
That's funny.
it also felt like having someone who's like, it made time there easier because it was like one of us was there with us. You know,
Right.
it made you feel less alone.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I figured. What were you don't have to tell me, but what were y'all bickering about? Was it just like little
Oh,
things?
I've tried to take a restorative tone this entire interview
Yeah.
about how people should get along.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
going to
yeah.
lay out the things that we bickered
All
about.
right, all right, all right,
Yeah,
all right.
I
Yeah,
think he would
here I am
appreciate that too.
dividing.
I'm sure if I said any of it, then he'll double down and be like, Andy was wrong, and here's the reason why. And
Yeah, I'll have to have
yeah,
I'll have to see if Daniel will want to come on the podcast. That'd be fun. I don't know. Does he do much media or
I
I
don't
don't
think so, but
yeah.
you can always ask.
Yeah, I might have to reach out to you to see if you could ask him for me. Um, but no, that's great. Like, and I recommend the movie, by the way. It's very heartbreaking because it kind of follows him leading up, and the same thing with Will Potter's book. He just had media guys around him while he was like, and the saddest scene is like sort of the day before he turns himself in, and he's just going out in nature with his family and hiking, and the it reminds me that you had done that interview with Democracy Now, and I'm wondering, like on the day that you turned yourself in, you did that interview with Democracy Now. It must just be, I've never been to prison. It must be just a surreal feeling knowing that you're just about to go walk in uh, and not come out for a while. What were those days like for you leading up to that? Sorry to take you back to probably a hard time.
It was hard. It was hard. Um, I think for anyone who faces that, the beginning always feels insurmountable, and it's as if time slows in the beginning and in the end, and in the middle, it moves faster.
Mm,
Right? It slows in the beginning because everything in front of you seems insurmountable. Right? It seems like, how could I possibly face these 3 years? And in my particular case, without getting into great detail, I was approached by agents shortly before surrendering myself. I think it was 2 days beforehand, and they had mentioned all these other crimes that I'm facing prosecution for, and would I like to just debrief, similar to that of Daniel McGowan, and do like this global plea where I just say these are the things I did in exchange for like a 5 or 10 year sentence. And they said, when one of the agents said something like, wouldn't it feel nicer to know that it's all taken care of and you can move on with your life? We just tie a bow around it and we get one steady number, as opposed to, you serve this sentence, you get out, you get remanded to state custody, you face charges in New Jersey, face charges here, face charges there. And they listed a list of things. And like I had said previously, some of them were things that I did and some of them were things that I didn't do. But just that seed that they planted by telling me that before I turned myself in made things so much worse in the beginning, because it was like, I didn't know if it was going to be 3 years or 15 years,
wow.
And then they threw me in solitary confinement for 21 days after I did the Democracy Now! Interview. And the same lawyer, Gideon Oliver, had to fight to get me out of solitary confinement. That time in the solitary confinement also gave me this feeling like, well, would the whole sentence be like this in this setting? Extremely harsh, with my own thoughts and nothing else, right? It made me very afraid for my mental health, and made me very afraid that, like, what if I was to crack And if I cracked, would I tell on my friends? And that led to things like, and content warning here, it led to things like suicidal ideation, because I started thinking, I'm not going to put another person through what I'm going through, and how could I stop this? And I started thinking about taking my life as a remedy to that. So that was difficult, the beginning, and time moved very slow in the beginning. But then when I got into a routine in North Carolina, was doing things like writing, tutoring, running the track every day, painting in the art room at night, making myself a snack before bed, and I developed a routine, days started going by a lot faster, right? And then just as you near the end, it slows down again. But it slows down for a positive reason. It slows down because you see the finish line, you can't wait for it to arrive. And so it slows down again. So that's kind of like time is relative when you're incarcerated. You look back on time in solitary confinement, it looks like a single slide in the slide deck, right? You don't really have many images of it, but my God, is there strange feelings attached to it, especially if you have a PTSD episode, right? You might remember all the feelings of one moment, right?
Yeah.
But it seems so short, but in those moments while living them, it felt excruciating. It felt like you can't even make it to the end of that 24 hours, especially if there was things like the lights stay on. It's very hard to make sense of what time of day it is and that kind of stuff. It's very disorienting.
Did you have like books at that time? Like, were you able to read things?
The second time I went to solitary confinement, yes, I had books. They had a book cart. The first time I either didn't know how to advocate for myself to get the book cart, or they were prohibiting me for having any things at all.
So you had like zero stimulation for those 21 days, is what you're saying? Basically.
I feel like towards the end of those 21 days, I received some mail. That was it was towards the end of the 21 days. That was either because of a delay of people not having the correct address, and then by the time they got the correct address and it made it through the various sensors and stuff, that it eventually reached me towards the end of those 21 days. So mail did arrive, and that was a big window to the outside world, and there was stimulus. Second time I was in solitary confinement, I knew that they allowed us to have one book like the Bible, and one like personal book. And every day when the book cart would come by, I would advocate for a new personal book. And so I remember reading like a variety of fiction books as well. Some science fiction, some other books like Snow Falling on Cedars, which I was surprised. That book moved me tremendously while in solitary confinement in North Carolina, because that book is about romance and love during the time of Japanese internment. And I feel like it taught me a lot about that period of time when it came to the treatment of Japanese nationals here in the United States during a time of war. And then a few months later, after reading that book, I arrive at the CMU, and there's definitely echoes of Korematsu. There's echoes of Japanese internment in the way they treated, Arab nationals and Muslims in the wake of 9/11. There's definitely similarities there. It's not exactly the same, but there's similarities.
Wow. Well, you answered my question, because I always like end the interviews with like questions about like, do you have book recommendations? And you can give me more recommendations if you want. But but before that, I just want to ask you, you kind of answered it, but how important is mail? Like you mentioned the letters from Rabbit, and also these letters that you got during your stay. Is that something that is like a critical lifeline for prisoners?
Absolutely, is absolutely critical, the mail that people receive. I know that there are people out there that will hear this and be like, well, what could I possibly write to this prisoner? Like, you could write about what you did that day. You could write about what you saw while out on a hike. You could write about the food that you ate. They're not going to be insulted that you're writing them about your experiences. If anything, they could live tangentially or vicariously through your experiences that day. It gives them a window to the free world. And so those letters for me were like a life preserver. And I would recommend that people always, always write prisoners, always send them books, always put money on their commissary, always, if you can get on their visiting list, go visit them, have physical touch with them, hold their hand for a second, give them a hug, because there's nothing like that in there. And that can make or break someone's psychological well-being during that time period.
I have some friends who are like more involved in like advocating for political prisoner letter writing and stuff like that. So I'll check in with them to get like a website link, because there are some websites that have like lists of people who are doing time for animal rights or environmental causes or any kind of
Yeah,
cause.
I mean, you could look up the Anarchist Black Cross. They maintain a list of current political prisoners across movements. Oh, and Books Through Bars. Books Through Bars is a great organization when it comes to sending books to prisoners.
Okay, well, great. Well, speaking of books, like I said, are there any like books that have really inspired you beyond this one I wrote down, The Snow Falling on Cedars, um and just like I asked this also, like, sort of as like a window on like things that if it inspire people, but also just things like people enjoy, because we spent all this time talking about like heavy subjects. Like, what do you like to get into? Like, who's Andy beyond the animal rights Andy that we all know and love?
Oh man, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
So I love nature. I am a geriatric surfer holding on to my 19-year-old self. So I love being out in the ocean whenever I get a chance to be out in the ocean. Even when I don't surf well, I like just sitting there with my board, because there's something about being immersed in the salt water, like enveloped by nature, seeing life around you. It is a kind of grounding that I don't think we have in our regular lives. It's the antithesis of something like a Times Square where there's constant digital stimuli. So I do very much enjoy those settings, even when the waves aren't great or I'm not surfing all that great. Just being there and being present with it is something that I find to be restorative. I also, I'm kind of a procrastinator, right? Like, I want to do this project, Gethsemane, but I also have all these like mental roadblocks where I'm very worried about like what is the right thing to say and what isn't the right thing to say. But in that is something else that I'm completely enamored by, and that is like the concept of God being a verb as opposed to a noun. And that's something that's really it's not something that I've come up with on my own. It's something I heard a philosopher say, and it's had a really big impact on my life, because I've had one or two experiences in my life that I can't possibly explain. And I may allude to them at the end of this project that I'm finished writing, because it partially connects to the way that I've dehumanized myself, right? I've chased this thing for so long. It's had all these negative effects on my life, right? And I'm hoping just to find what this thing is that I got caught a glimpse of, right? And it's like so profound that like I remember the date and time and context in which it happened, right? Like, it was March 23rd of 2008, around 10:30 to 11 a.m. And it was as if like this is like a climax of my life, right? And when you tell other people that, when I got married and tried to explain to my wife like what this date and time has in terms of significance for me and like everything I'm looking for in life, I realized how much I alienated others by being so caught in that moment. Like, if I try to put myself in my wife's shoes, and we're now separated, right? Partially because of this. When I try to put myself in her shoes, I realize how insulting it could seem that I'm looking backwards towards a day where I was in prison and I experienced something, as if the marriage to her or the birth of our children was not somehow more important than this thing I keep looking backwards towards, right? And I think she sees that as an extension of my PTSD, and maybe my therapist does as well. So I'm being very honest with you and your audience right now to say that maybe I'm deluded, right? Because I have to, like, I also adhere to like strong principles of like sound journalism and telling the truth, that maybe I'm deluded, but for whatever reason, I look at this and I start every day and I end every day thinking about it, right? And I try to process the world through a lens that I developed on that day, and for better or for worse. And so in my daily life, if I can find things that intersect those feelings, that intersect um, this vastness of the world around us, I try to always find it. I try to always steep myself in it. I always try to embrace it. And by that, for to speak in layman's terms that aren't religious, that aren't specifically related to faith, it's this idea of paring down the world to all of the actions that we have amongst each other and in society, across stellar bodies and everything, that everything is kind of set in motion. It's not predetermined, right? But there's equal kind of physics to the way that we interact with each other, right? My brother is somewhat like this as well. He's very into pattern recognition and math. I'm less strong when it comes to things like math, but one night while out jogging, I started thinking about dehumanization and othering, the same topics we discussed during this podcast, as being very similar to that of Pythagorean's theorem. If you increase, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, if c squared is discord, violence, and horrible things happening between two groups of people and or animals and or the environment, if this suffering is the hypotenuse of the triangle, it's informed by the two other factors that we put into it. And one of those factors is the distance that we create between ourselves and that subject. The other factor for humans specifically is how many are on top of each other in a populated area. So if people are siloed into a social media ecosystem where there's a lot of people yelling over each other, then the outsized, most hyperbolic takes are going to percolate to the top and going to be amplified by the algorithm, and thus amplify suffering, amplify discord, amplify the way that we're taking down each other and tearing our movements apart, right? That's the amplification in the hypotenuse. But the other leg of it is the distance we put between each other. If you could throw that distance down to zero, the hypotenuse will always fall to zero as well, if you can collapse that distance. And so the project that I started writing is largely based on this hypothesis that if we collapse that distance between ourselves and animals, our willful imposition of suffering on animals will collapse as well. If we collapse that distance between us and our neighbors, we'll always see them as neighbors and not see them as others. If we collapse that distance between us and migrants, we're not going to see them as a drain on our economy or as a specter that we use in our political discourse. If we collapse that distance between Israelis and Palestinians, they're going to see each other as both citizens of the Levant that come from the same book, that love each other, that share the same DNA, that 114 years ago, they were breastfeeding each other's children. I don't know. That sounded kind of poetic. I'm sorry.
That was beautiful. That was so nice. Yeah, I was just thinking you said it, like decreasing the distance between people. So yeah, I've really enjoyed sharing this space with you for this podcast. And
yeah, we collapsed some distance, right?
we did. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely like going surfing with somebody. I'll second that about surfing. Yes, I also surf and haven't for a long time. I would love to get back to it. But yeah, there is nothing like sitting on your board, especially in those moments when you're like out there on your own. I would get up in the morning and go surf in the morning as the sun was coming up. And I was a shitty surfer, like I wasn't good. I'd get up on the board sometimes. But yeah, there's nothing like being out there and watching the sun come up and just feeling small in the ocean and seeing like the calm and the shimmer. It's just, for people who are stressed out. And one of my favorite movies growing up was Endless Summer and Endless Summer 2. I remember this quote really well. They were talking to this African surfer who said, when you're out there surfing among the waves, doesn't matter what stress or whatever problem you've got in your life, you're just thinking about the wave. And that sums it up really well about surfing.
Have
And
you ever
yeah,
surfed in the snow?
no. Surfed in the snow? I have
Yeah,
not.
I remember a couple of days up here when it was snowing while out in the lineup, and it got so quiet. It's as if like you can't really hear the wave crashing. It's
Wow.
like everything has this suppressor on it because of the snow. It's fascinating.
Wow.
And especially up here in December, because in December the water's still fairly warm
Hmm.
in Long Island. But we can easily get a snowstorm in December. So like if you time it correctly, like you could be out in your wetsuit fairly comfortable in the water, and then the snow starts and it's just quiet. And
Yeah.
there's like hardly any people out. It's different than sunrise where you see the beauty of the sun and everything else like that. This is like, it's a little bit darker, but it's still
Hmm.
beautiful. It's really
Yeah.
beautiful.
Well, I mean, I mentioned the sunrise just because like I have such vivid memories, but also the storms. I mean, like when you would just see different colors on the water. And yeah, surfing in the winter was fine. I mean, I was in the South, but
Mhm.
the wetsuits, like they do the job. They do the
Mhm.
job. So
Definitely.
yeah. Well, that's cool. Well, if I ever get up to New York, I'll give you a call. Maybe we could go surfing or something. That'd be
Yeah, we'll
fun.
definitely go surfing.
Yeah.
I got a couple extra boards, so you can borrow one of
Yeah.
mine.
Nice. Just be aware that it's been many years since
Dude,
I've
it's fine.
surfed, so
I'm
don't
no
be
good
crappy.
myself.
Well, Andy, it's been so lovely talking to you. This is honestly like I think this is by far the longest podcast I've done, and it didn't feel that way. It felt like very like I could talk to you for hours and hours. So you're one of the more thoughtful people that I've had on this podcast, and I love that. And yeah, I hope that people stuck around. Maybe I'll put it in 2 parts or whatever. But it's been such a joy talking to you.
Awesome. Yeah, anything you could do to adjust for my ADHD in continuity, like in post, like maybe move different parts
Move.
around.
I'll
Yeah.
see. That might require a lot more work than I'm
All
but I'll definitely take out the
right. Well, then people will learn the truth. I'm scatterbrained. I might have good
they'll know.
ideas, but I'm scatterbrained.
Well, they'll know that I can't structure an interview to save my life. All
Okay.
right.
All right. Thank
Appreciate
you for
you, Andy.
everything.